We are very pleased to have the presence of the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, an old friend, Christine Lagarde, who has been doing yeoman's work for a number of years on various hotspots in the world economy. And I can think of no one better to have here to give us a brief review of how she sees the world than Christine. I run into her all over. She's all over the world, China, Boao Forum. I could name all of these places. She never stops. And I don't think there's been a managing director of the International Monetary Fund who's covered more ground than Christine. My first question to you, and thank you for coming, is I've noticed in the latest forecast of the International Monetary Fund that you're somewhat more optimistic than the last report you've had over the last couple of quarters, both for this year and next year. And I'd be very interested, I know the audience would be, to get your thoughts, particularly on the United States, briefly United States, China, Europe, and Japan, in the sense of the developed world, and then what you think about the emerging markets and how that's playing into all of this. Because a year ago when we sat here, the IMF wasn't too optimistic and things didn't look too good. So I would just put that as an opener. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And I'm delighted to be with you, but I would ask you to convey my best wishes to Jim, right, who was going to be with us. And I'm delighted to see many friends and familiar faces. So it's lovely to see you and to be with you. I think for the first time in many projections, many updates of our world economic outlook, for the first time we are revising upward. So in and of itself, I think it's an interesting proposition, because we are constantly anticipated that things would actually get better and got a bit worse. The second point about this forecast that was just released yesterday by Maury Opsfeld, our new chief economist, is that compared with a 3.1% growth last year, we are forecasting 3.5% growth this year, which is a significant upside from last year, and 3.6% for 2018, which is stable, same forecast that we had back in October. What's also interesting, third point, is that when I look at the column of forecast on a per region, per country basis, contrary to all the columns that we have had for the last 8 years since the financial crisis, there is not a single country that is contracting. So growth is actually across the board. And it applies to advanced economies as it does to emerging market economies and developing countries. On that latter note, I have to say that to see that sub-Saharan Africa is coming back a little bit, not certainly enough, you know, on a per capita basis, I think it's minimal at best. But at least it's trending in a better direction than what we had seen, and that's where we need to see a lot of growth. The advanced economies that you've asked me to focus on, we clearly have a much stronger growth forecast for the United States as compared with last year. Same forecast from our January forecast, but that's almost, I mean, it's relevant for us, but it's not relevant in terms of job creations and activity. But there's a clear increase of GDP in the US, which is predicated on a variety of things. One is clearly a pickup from mid-2016, so it's not something that is just a recent development. It had been in the cards since mid-2016 with more investment, and the manufacturing sector is picking up in particular. And there has clearly been, in the last 3 months, since the election, expectations that have been on the rise, which have also fueled the hope for better in terms of fiscal, small stimulus probably, better in terms of investment in infrastructure. What form it takes, we don't know yet, but it's in the air. And expectations that there will be a tax reform at minima, a corporate, and now we're talking about also household income tax reform that will also encourage growth. So that's for the US, and it's clearly a part of the economy that is a major engine going forward. And we're seeing it in the commodity markets, we're seeing it also in those countries that are heavy exporters towards the United States. Europe is stable at 1.7%. That's where we see it, but at least it's sort of consolidated growth at a too low a pace still, but getting at least on a par with last year. And Japan is doing a little bit better as well. So that's the picture as we have it for the advanced economies. We have seen a very mixed situation of the emerging market economies, and I hate to put them in one single bucket because they each have the idiosyncratic reasons for having been low or being on the rise now. If you look at China, for instance, we had seen China a little bit lower than where it is at the moment. There is clearly a continued stimulus and investment continues to be on the rise, including in a housing sector which never seems to get tired or slowing down, and which is fueled by abundant credit, including from the shadow banking sector. We are seeing a Russia that had suffered from the low price of oil, but which is now picking up a bit now that the oil price is in the region of $50 rather than $30 per barrel. And Brazil is hopefully, coming back from what has been a very, very severe period where the combination of low demand, corruption, low commodity prices has clearly affected the country together with the political uncertainty. So that's, in a nutshell, the situation as it is. Now, I could go down the road of taking you through the downside risks on the horizon, which are more on the downside than the upside, and then the policy recommendation, and I would have done my job as managing director of the IMF. But I don't know whether you want me to do that or not.
Well, thank you. As you said, you gave it to us in a nutshell, but just following up on the world's second largest economy, which you mentioned briefly, China, one of the major concerns that people have about China is this tremendous increase in debt. The estimates go for 250% of GDP to 280% of GDP. That depends if you want to stick in the interbank borrowings. The point of the shadow banking, which you mentioned, which is not properly regulated, and actually the question of whether the state-owned banks are really showing the proper levels of non-performings. And then, of course, you get down to the whole question of overcapacity in the zombie companies in coal, steel, shipbuilding, etc. And one of the major concerns, as you know, is that this stuff is being pushed forward like it was like a snowplow there until after the 19th Party Congress this fall. And China has been the great driver on commodities, and the concern is whether the government waits too long to tackle these problems before they become a major problem for China. And if it's a major problem for China, it's a major problem for the world growth. So maybe you might want to comment a little bit on that.
Well, I think you've said it all. In a way, you are Mr. China. I think you're very correct in your assessment. I would add that the policies that would be needed, which the Chinese authorities are needed, are probably not going to be put in place until a year from now, maybe a little less than a year from now. But once the Congress is over, then we are likely to see more movement than what we see at the moment. Everything that we hear, every analysis that we conduct drives us to that conclusion, that not a lot is going to happen, that there is some reform. I don't think we should just jump to the conclusion that nothing happens on particularly on the front of state-owned enterprises in two sectors, coal and to a lesser degree steel. There is a little bit happening. I hope what we see, comes next November, December, is a good, that the baton be passed on to the provincial authorities, because that's really an issue which the central government knows it has to tackle, is not going to leverage yet for the moment, but will have to, because that's where you have a lot of credit creation, and that's where the shadow banking is prospering at the clip of about 30% per year, which is huge.
Right. One of the areas that you've been concerned about, and there are a lot of economists worldwide, Marty Feldstein has done a lot of work on this, is the whole question of productivity. And you have mentioned that very often in your speeches as worldwide problem, particularly in the so-called advanced economies, developed world, whatever you want to say. And maybe you might want to have some comments on that.
Well, I did speak quite a bit about it recently, because we have just recently produced a paper that I highly recommend, which is a staff discussion note, actually, which in my view could be elevated to a higher degree, but that's something that we will decide upon later, which is called Gone with the Headwinds. So productivity. And I think the whole very thorough analytical work that has been done in that respect points us in the direction which is a little bit intuitive, actually, and not so much counterintuitive. That, number one, productivity is fueled by innovation, and there are policies that can work and that can be effective in order to stimulate and encourage innovation. Combination of public spending in some basic research programs combined with some research and development tax credits that are proving to be effective, as the Fiscal Affairs Department has demonstrated recently. So innovation on the one hand, public level combined with support to the private sector investment in innovation. That's number one. Number two, and a second finding of that paper, is that trade has clearly been an accelerator of productivity, and is therefore desirable if what we want to achieve is a better productivity in order to fuel growth, in order to reallocate better and to reach a more inclusive growth at the end of the day. And third, again, third conclusion of that paper is that there are legacies from the crisis that are actually weighing on the ability to increase productivity. And one good example of that is the fact that quite a few of those, not necessarily state-owned enterprises in China, but quite a few corporates, and not just in the United States for sure, are actually burdened by debt, which is actually putting a brake on their capacity to innovate and invest. Added to which, you have had companies that found themselves in a position where they have to go through fire sales of their assets, and therefore find themselves underinvested, with not enough capital, not enough innovations, and therefore ended as, incapacitated or crippled corporates that actually weigh on this productivity issue. I highly recommend the paper.
Well, I think we'll all make sure we read it. One of the things I wanted to ask you about also, which I think the fund has done yeoman's work on, and it's not been easy, and I know it's maybe a difficult moment to discuss it, but every time Jim introduces you here and asks for comments from the floor, I have my hand up asking about Greece, because I personally think, and I know these discussions are ongoing here, but I personally think the fund's attitude on insisting on debt relief is correct. And so maybe if you think you might say something in the midst of this on Greece, I think it would be very, very important, because it's a country that's basically been in recession for 7 years, which in most areas would be called a depression, not a recession. So, and I spent some time there a few months ago, and I think all of your feelings there, I see very strongly as you go around Greece.
Well, with a last name like yours, it's hardly surprising that you spent a bit of time in Greece, actually, and I envy you. Well, first of all, the IMF does not have a program with Greece, right, as we speak. So there have been programs in the past, but those programs are gone, and there is no program in place at the moment. Greece is under program with the ESM, which is the European Stability Mechanism, under the supervision of that institution and with clear support from the European Commission and the European Central Bank. The reason the IMF is not in a program with the others and is not forming part of the Troika as we used to, is that the conditions under which we could engage and put international community financing on those programs are not satisfied. And what I've always said repeatedly and boringly is that the program that we would put in place with Greece would have to walk on two legs. The first leg is significant reforms that will deliver sustainable growth going forward. So not the low-hanging fruits where you can actually fill in the hole and make sure that you reach a certain level of primary surplus, as has been done occasionally in the past, including under some of our programs. So sustainable, or sustainably, all right, I'll start back the other way. Reforms that affect the Greek economy so that it procures sustainable growth. And that's why we insist on tax reform and pension reform. And that pension reform, the Greek authorities know that it's badly needed because it drives them into a massive accumulated deficit, and one that continues to accumulate over the course of time. So that's leg number one. Leg number two, a debt of Greece that is sustainable. And as we see it at the moment, the debt of Greece is not sustainable, which leads us to the conclusion that at the present time, under current circumstances and reasonable hypotheticals, there has to be a debt restructuring. So until those two legs actually operate, we are not going to be in a program with Greece. Now, having said that, to be perfectly accurate with you, what we have seen in the last few weeks is encouraging on leg number one. So parametric reforms being accepted by the Greek authorities with a sequencing which over the course of time should not affect the growth that is now picking up a little bit. And this is what we are recommending. Of course, the devil is going to be in the details, which is why our team will be going back to Greece after the spring meetings to actually detail all that and make sure that it's in the legislation. The second leg, which is the debt sustainability analysis, we need to conduct on the basis of forecasts, hypotheticals that are sensible and reasonable, and that do not anticipate a primary surplus that is going to be at 3.5% for the next 10 years or so, because it's just not possible and not deliverable, and we know it. So I've been as exhaustive as I could.
No, I think you covered the problem very well, and just hope that the view of the fund prevails, because personally I think it's the right one. I think we would like, if you're willing, to open it up to a few questions. Sure. So if we have a few questions in the audience, we have a little time here, and if you'd raise your hand and just say who you are and who you represent, I think that the managing director will try and answer. Do we have a question? Jacob, you had your hand up, so. It's Jacob Frankel, JP Morgan Chase. I think everyone knows him, so Jacob.
Thank you, former economic counselor of the fund, which is my claim to fame.
Welcome home.
Years ago, the objective was always growth, and indeed you described what happens to growth. After a while, the mantra changed to sustainable growth, and more recently, you introduced inclusive growth. Now, the numbers that you mentioned at the beginning really did not relate to the inclusiveness or the sustainable. But I want really to ask about the inclusive. Is there any progress there, and do we have any reference in view of the numbers you told us about the aggregate growth? Thank you.
You know, I don't claim credit for the inclusiveness, although I would certainly fight for it. I think it was under the G20 Chinese presidency that the word inclusive found its way in the G20 communique, and we started having SSB, which was solid, sustainable, and balanced, to having SSBI, solid, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive. And I certainly hope that inclusive stays as an objective and one by which we want to measure success. You know, I think the objective of making it inclusive applies with three different dimensions to it. I think there is the issue of inclusiveness within a country, and the research that has been done by the research department here at the IMF clearly demonstrates that too much inequality leads to unsustainable growth, and therefore the objective of including, of reducing excessive inequality is, one demonstration of that sort of within-country dimension of inclusive. The second dimension is across, I would say, across generations and across gender. As you know, Jacob, I'm particularly keen on the latter. And I think that I don't need to convince anybody that women are very often either excluded, undercompensated, overexploited, and so on and so forth. And we will continue to do research in that respect, and we are streamlining and operationalizing under the bilateral surveillance that we do in Article 4, that particular dimension of the across generation and across gender. Across generation, what I mean by that is looking at the issue of debt, for instance, which is clearly climbing in many corners of the world, and where it's reaching levels that we haven't seen since the Second World War. And that's clearly a dimension that needs to be tackled, needs to be addressed, and I think we should continue to have those discussions. By the same token, passing on liabilities to the next generation is also, not caring much about climate change and the disaster that it could inflict on our economies. And it also means not necessarily maintaining infrastructures that going forward would be necessary for the expansion of an economy. So that's the intergenerational and intergender dimension of this inclusiveness. The last one is sort of between countries. How do we include? And in that respect, I'm going to plead for our chapel here, which is that decisions made in a particular corner of the world, particularly if those economies are systemic, will have an impact on other economies. And the spillover aspects of monetary policies, for instance, or the way in which a particular tax reform is conducted will have an impact on other economies, and those spillover effects need to be taken into account. So that's my sort of three-dimensional view of trying to be more inclusive.
Very complete answer. Let's hope you achieve it. Let's hope the world achieves it, because it's all of us together. Do you have time for one or two more?
Okay.
Okay.
Ian Talley, Wall Street Journal. Madam,
Monsieur?
Oh, good to see you. The title of the conference is The Future of Globalism and Multilateralism. I'm wondering if, on that point, you have seen or fear any change in the U.S. commitment to to multilateralism through the IMF and World Bank. Can or is the IMF prepared to do anything to address U.S. concerns about the failures of multilateralism through the Bretton Woods organizations? And finally, on that point, would the IMF be prepared to issue its ESR or its external balance assessment or exchange rate assessment on a more regular basis, as it does with the fiscal monitor, the WEO, and the GFSR?
Thank you, Jan, for those easy questions. So you don't have to bother repeating them tomorrow, unless I don't respond to your questions. Now, let me just go to the ESR. It's, as you well know, it's a very heavy-duty work, which leads us to assess on a per-country basis for about 29 of them, if I recall, that cover about 80% of total GDP. Not only they currency relative to others, but their reserves, their current account, and several other elements. And it just analyzes their external position. We try to make the best use of that into the bilateral surveillance that we do on an annual basis, once a year. So the fact that we actually operate these two in parallel, and that one actually feeds the other, so that we can find in each and every Article 4 of those 29 countries the ESR assessment that is conducted on a cohesive basis, where we keep those 29 countries together. I think that really pleads strongly in favor of having it once a year. And you know, some of those components don't vary with as much regularity and periodicity as other elements. So as it stands, I think the ESR is a complicated exercise. There is an element of judgment about it, which needs to be scrutinized, which needs to be challenged eventually when it's you know, supported by the desk of a particular country. And all of that needs the intellectual integrity and the time that it takes to actually get to the bottom of that judgmental part of it, which we try to reduce to the maximum. You know, on the rest of it, multilateralism is, as you know, the essence of this institution and the reason why it was set up as it was 70 years ago. 70 years is no guarantee for perennity. And it requires that we re-examine the services that we provide, that we constantly respond to the needs of the international community and the membership. It is no surprise that we provide a lot more technical assistance than we had in the past. It is no surprise that the surveillance itself has evolved from being much more bilateral to being much more multilateral as well. It is no surprise that we look at macro-critical issues such as gender, such as equality, such as climate change, for instance, whenever that is macro-critical in a particular country. So the institution is changing, and we will continue to do that in order to adjust to the needs of the membership. And we will be listening to all members as they themselves change over the course of time. But everything that I have seen leads me to believe that all members believe in the virtue and the value of free, fair and global trade, for instance. And I believe that all members are keen to examine what can be done in order to make sure that trade benefits all under conditions that are fair and that constitute a level playing field. And we will continue to try to deliver on that front.
Thank you very much. I think if we have time for one more question, but I think your comments on trade and the importance of trade are really right up front with what's going on in the world today, without a doubt. So one more question, and please try and make it one question, not 3 or 4. Yes.
I'm Dee Smith, CEO of Strategic Insight Group and also Vice Chair of the Advisory Committee of the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies at University of Texas. So my question is about Latin America, and I wondered if you could comment on what you see going on there, particularly with 3 key countries, Brazil, Venezuela, and Mexico, but in general, in terms of the things that you're observing. Thank you.
I asked the same question to the head of the Latin American department because it's well, first of all, it's a continent, but it has you know, clearly different countries following different paths, and depending on whether they have copper or plenty of agriculture, or if they have oil, or if they are the Caribbeans, which are also, from our perspective, part of that region as well, they have a different fate. But what we see is a region that has had the benefit of sort of low cost of financing, high prices of commodities, a relative political stability in the main, and as a result, quite a few prosperous years. That was until about 4 years ago, when things began to change. And for the last 3 years, most of those not all of them, but I would put Mexico a little bit apart. I think Mexico is a bit of that sort of juncture between 2 regions. But most of those countries have had either negative or very, very low growth. And the whole region was driven down by Brazil in particular, which is clearly the largest and the one that was not doing well. So what we're seeing going forward is a relative stability at around 1.5% growth for the region, with different phenomena depending on the situation, and particularly the price of commodities and the kind of exports that those countries benefit from. We're also seeing sources of big concern. Venezuela is one, clearly. it's not a question of if, but a question of when. And we are all very concerned watching it happen. Mexico is, you know, a case in and of itself. And the discussions that are going on at the moment under NAFTA, the way in which NAFTA is being renegotiated and how it will affect Mexico is going to be critical for the for that country. There are elections coming up in a little over a year now in Mexico, which will have an impact as well on the future of Mexico. So I would again put Mexico a little bit aside because it's far more dependent on the policies decided in the U.S. and the NAFTA arrangement than the rest of Latin America. But what the teams tell me is that Latin America, for the moment, is going to sort of grow at that stable, albeit relatively low rate of growth going forward.
Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you very much, first of all, for making these premises available for us, for all the support you give us, because we deeply believe, all of us here, in the work that you and your staff are doing. I think the world really needs you and your staff. I mean, the situation in Greece, I think the attitude, this is a personal opinion that you're taking there, I think is very, very important as an example. And so, again, thank you for giving us your time. And let's give her a big hand for the work she and the fund do.
All right. Thank you, Madame Lagarde, for offering your time and for kicking off our meeting in a slightly awkward but fulfilling manner, ultimately. But what would be a Bretton Woods Committee meeting without an audio snafu or an agenda change? So we thought we'd get that out of the way early and share our adjustments with you. Thank you also, Bill Rhodes, who has been a real leader for the Bretton Woods Committee over the past several years as part of our advisory council. But he's played more and more of a leadership role with us. And both he and I are taking the place of Jim Wolfenson and Dick Debs today, who both unfortunately, had minor health challenges that temporarily precluded them from traveling. So we're unfortunate that they couldn't make it for this particular program. And they just gave us their sincerest apologies and regrets and best wishes for this program, so we wish them very speedy recovery as well. And welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. For those of you, most of you I know the Bretton Woods Committee, but there are a few of you in the room that don't. And so, the committee is the nonpartisan group of citizens, working to promote economic cooperation and to drive improvements and reforms to those Bretton Woods institutions that we valued over the years. And we're very active in sort of three fronts. One, we do this kind of work. We put on our programs to bridge the public-private sector dialogue and try and drive a reform discussion forward. We also do education and advocacy when necessary to remind groups, for example, the U.S. Congress, that sometimes forget what the World Bank or the IMF or the MDBs actually do. And thirdly, we provide advice and ideas when these Bretton Woods institutions ask for them, as we've done today, actually, which left us very excited, working with Joaquim Levy at the World Bank here, CFO, who partnered with us earlier on a program today, where we brought committee members with expertise and infrastructure financing together with not only the World Bank Group representatives, but representatives from the EIB and representatives from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, as well as IDB, to share ideas on ways to catalyze additional infrastructure investment for emerging markets. And so we've done that as well for the IMF, and we're always looking for opportunities to collaborate and share the committee's great expertise and experience that we have as a whole. Let me just share a moment about our theme. As you'd seen earlier, we have a very provocative theme. Topics that could easily be resolved within 3 to 4 hours, I'm sure. But in reality, we wanted to create this discussion under circumstances of unique political uncertainty, a lot of market and social anxiety, as well as what many would characterize as a growing global movement of populism and economic nationalism that, if nothing else, looks to at least test and perhaps reset some of the assumptions and some of the tenets and the relationships that have underpinned global economic cooperation since the founding of the Bretton Woods institutions in '44. And I think how this uncertainty and how this anxiety and how this populism manifests itself around the globe in terms of its impact on the progress, on the policies, on the institutions themselves, and on the practices that have helped shape global economic growth and financial stability, financial reform, and trade and development as we know them today. I think that's one of the great questions that we all would like a crystal ball to answer. But in the absence of procuring one of those, we procured the next best thing. We procured a collective set of influential leaders who I think have as great a sense of foresight as anyone might expect in these turbulent times, to help us make sense of why we've collectively gotten to where we are, and more importantly, where our current versions of globalism and multilateralism appear to be headed. I do want to give a special thanks to the IMF, obviously, for opening their doors to us and partnering with us in this venue. And sincere thanks to SICPA and Philippe Amon. They've been our partner for many years now in several of our flagship programs, and a great partner at that. A company that's really at the forefront of financial stability and security, and celebrating their 90th anniversary this year. So appreciate SICPA's support for us in this event of ours. And a couple housekeeping notes. Obviously, you don't want to be that person that we hear your ringtone, so please keep your phones on silent. We don't have breaks built into our agenda, so please step out for the restrooms as you see fit. And we'll have refreshments in the atrium until about 3:30, as well as a reception afterwards at 6 o'clock. You've seen we'll have facilitated question time, however abbreviated at least, after every segment. So please, again, raise your hand and offer up a question, not necessarily a comment. Okay, with that, I believe we're ready for, are we ready for our next segment? We have a conversation on multilateral leadership in global development. We'll hear views from the World Bank's CEO, Kristalina Georgieva, and then followed by views from the president of the Asian Development Bank. So I would like to introduce Dr. Guillermo Ortiz, chairman of Latin America at BTG Pactual. Formerly, he was chairman of Grupo Financiero Banorte, and as you all know, served as Mexico's central bank governor, as well as actually several positions here at the fund itself years back. Dr. Ortiz and Ms. Georgieva, I invite you to please take the stage.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
The last segment, the speakers had been using this mic. These mics come back from them.
Okay, this is the backup.
Yep.
So backup.
Okay, thank you.
Is this working? Good.
And if it is working on my side, we are good to go.
Well, it's a great pleasure having you. I'm supposed to introduce you, but you obviously need no introduction. And anyone who's interested in her background can look at this pamphlet where she fills a couple of pages. Let me just say that she has had extensive experience in the World Bank, in the European Commission, at the United Nations, but she's been with the bank again since early 2017, and you are the CEO of the World Bank. Before coming to this room, some people were asking me, what is exactly the CEO of the World Bank? Yes, I know that the insiders of the World Bank all know what it's about, but why don't you tell us just very briefly what CEO of the World Bank?
Okay, yes, great. Thank you very much for having me here. We have in the World Bank Group, as you probably know, 4 institutions. We have, well, actually 5, but 4 that have structures and people that are empowered as I am now to run them. So we have IFC, deals with private sector, and it is run by a CEO. We have MIGA, provides guarantees. It is run by CEO. So President Kim asked himself a very simple question. Why is it that IBRD and IDA, that are my big structural components, are not run by a person empowered to do that as a CEO? So here we are. He has created this position, and I'm extremely fortunate to be the first one in it. It sets the bar a bit high, because now I need to define what exactly that means. And it is actually very simple. 3 words. Well, 4 words. Run the World Bank.
Okay, that was very clear. Thank you very much, Rubio. Let me just start with a very general question and ask you, from the viewpoint of the World Bank, what do you see as the main sort of near-term and long-term development challenges, and what the role of the World Bank will be to meet these challenges? I will come later to questions about multilateralism, governance, and so on and so forth, but I would like to start with this very general question.
Well, to a certain degree, what we face in the near term and what are the long-term development challenges intertwine. Let me tell you, when I travel and meet with our client countries, what is top of mind for most of them? What are going to be the new drivers of growth? How we are going to get out of what has been a fairly slow growth environment for a long time. We are now in a situation when productivity stagnates in developed countries, but it is also fairly low or not moving very quickly in emerging markets. Underneath, we have everywhere practically the mother of all crises, which is the crisis of confidence. In different degrees. You go to East Asia, much more dynamic, but even there, people are a little worried that the world economy has not come out of the pre-crisis, during the post-crisis period, back to the pre-crisis growth levels. So that is one major concern. And that then translates into sluggish investments, a perception of risk that keeps private capital sitting in the banks. You mentioned I was in Europe. In Europe, we have this paradoxical situation when you pay the banks to keep your money there, negative interest rates. So that is one big concern near term, but it has, of course, underlying longer term reasons. And then we have something that breaks my heart, and it is the fact that in the 21st century there is famine in some parts of the world. South Sudan announced, Somalia practically announced, northern Nigeria knocking on the door. In Yemen, very dramatic situation. And when we look at the reasons for this 21st century famine, it is a combination of conflicts that make it impossible for simple things like growing your crop to happen, and it is the impact of climate change. And on top of it, you have the demographic trends that are in some countries too fast increase of people in areas that have difficulty to support it, and in other countries, people like kind of you and me dominating. If it wasn't for modern chemistry, I would have been gray-haired like you. So we have that set. So we have on one side anxieties affecting countries, emerging market economies and developed economies, and on other set we have the dramatic interface of violent extremism and climate change. And then we have the challenge of demography that represents itself in two very, very different ways in parts of the world. Now, we have this, and I would make two observations. One, the fact that shocks are more frequent, more severe, and overlay is with us to stay. It is a problem short term, it is a problem, I think, long term. These shocks, this crisis of today, different from the crisis when I came to the World Bank first in the 90s. Why different? Because they are simply not polite. In the old days, crisis would come, hit, and then the next one waits its turn until we recover from the first, and then it hits. Now they come, multiple shocks hit, and if you are in a fragile state, you simply cannot recover. And my second observation is that multilateralism that should be part of the solution is a little bit at risk, which you said we are not going to talk about right now, so I shut up.
Well, I think that you managed to set the stage in very, I would say in general, but also very vivid terms in what is really, the huge challenge of the world economy now, which is a combination of demography, politics, economics, and forces like climate change and so on and so forth. If we look back, before you entered the World Bank, back to the after World War II, I think one of the huge successes of international cooperation has been precisely the establishment and the actions of multilateral development banks. The first started with reconstruction after the war. If I recall correctly, the first loan of the World Bank, of the Bank of Reconstruction and Development, was to France.
Yes, indeed, France.
Multilateral institutions leading by the World Bank played a hugely important role in the development process, substituting, for a very scarce resource, which was a combination of technical knowledge and scarce resources for economic development. And this played over 50 years in an extremely useful fashion. Now things have changed. Emerging markets are half the world economy. And the problems that we had a few years ago, as you just mentioned, are not the ones that we're facing today. So the question is, given that multilateral institutions have been reduced in relative and in absolute, relative terms regarding the amount of resources available for development, for emerging markets and so on, what is the role of the World Bank in this new situation? And how can the World Bank play a more active role precisely in reviving this multilateralism which is in danger?
Well, the very good question, and of course, now during the spring meetings, that would be top of mind for people who gather here. A lot of what we have to do today, unfortunately, brings us back to that word reconstruction that is in the title of IBRD. Because of wars, because of the massive destruction that has been impeding development in quite a number of countries. You just think of Iraq, Afghanistan, the neighborhood affected by the spillover impacts of these conflicts. And now, of course, Syria, we really hope that they will come to talk about reconstruction of Syria. So we need to keep in the back of our mind that, unfortunately, this purpose, raison d'être, unfortunately, is there. But then comes a much more difficult question, and it is when the world economy is expanding to $78 trillion GDP last year, and the resources of the development banks, and I see here a very, very important partner in the development community, the president of the Asian Development Bank, in relative terms, even if they have increased in absolute terms, in relative terms are smaller and smaller vis-a-vis the needs, then the logical question is, how can we swing more financial resources into developing countries so we can bridge this gap? That term, and my colleague Joachim Levy is here, that term from billions to trillions has gotten into our vocabulary, development finance vocabulary. How do you do that? And the answer is by de-risking not only projects, which is what we know how to do, but can we de-risk sectors and countries? Can we make it possible for the financial resources that are now sleeping, virtually sleeping in financial institutions to flow into these riskier environments? And what would it take to do it? We believe in the World Bank that our critical purpose is to work with the other development banks so we can collectively be the tail that wags the financial dog. And we can get from billions to trillions as a result. This sounds abstract. Let me make it concrete. I was in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago. Vietnam is at the edge of unleashing the potential for solar and wind power. Remarkably, for a country so sunny, they don't have it now. They don't have it because the regulatory framework is not there. There is no predictability. The transmission capacity is not there. If you were to connect solar to grid, can't easily move around, and they don't have batteries. They don't have the storage capacity. If they were to have it, the potential for private investments in solar, and people say also wind, are enormous. We talk about potentially $1 invested in regulatory framework, transmission lines and storage, moving up to $30 of private investment in solar. Well, that is the kind of thinking we need to be able to make it possible for private investments to happen on a large scale. And even more so, to make it possible in the riskiest environments. Why should we be talking only about Vietnam? It's relatively well-structured and managed country. How about the Central African Republic? Shouldn't there be private sector going there? And what would it take to make it possible. So we now have at the World Bank an enormous demonstration of trust in multilateralism, despite all we are talking about, and it is our new IDA. IDA 18, I'm sorry, do you know what is IDA? Raise your hand. Okay, so I need to say what it is. The International Development Association is the soft loans grants window or institution as part of our group to help the poorest countries. And it gets replenished every 3 years. The previous replenishment was the 17th in line, and it delivered $50 billion IDA. The IDA 18 replenishment, the one that we just finished, delivered $75 billion of IDA. And I take this to be an optimistic sign that we still can come together to solve our problems. Countries like India and Nigeria contributed this time around, in addition to the traditional donors. So, closing this bracket. This IDA, this time, is not only bigger, it is different. A big chunk of IDA goes in the so-called private sector window. And the job it has is to make it possible for the riskiest environments to be de-risked sufficiently for private investments to take place. Is it going to be straightforward and easy? No. But is this absolutely paramount for us to identify what is the problem that makes it impossible for private sector to invest? Is it red tape? Is it bad regulation? Is it lack of infrastructure, physical or for that matter, financial or digital? And concentrate on fixating on these problems, removing these obstacles.
Well, very much related to this whole question of, you mentioned cooperation with other, international organizations, with other development banks in different regions to tackle the problems that you just mentioned. What do you make of the, recent U.S. policy of putting America first in terms of what it means for two, I would say, dimensions of action of multilateral institutions such as the World Bank. One is the governance aspect. The U.S. plays a fundamental role in the World Bank, in the Inter-American Development Bank, and in other development banks also. So what does that mean when you have the most important representative of the largest country speaking against multilateralism in a way? And how do you square that with the prominence in the decision-making of these institutions on the part of the U.S. government? That's number one problem. Number two has to do with resources. You mentioned IDA, the replenishment has already been done. It's great news. But as you also mentioned, the resources in relative terms are shrinking. And obviously there is no sentiment or mood, at least in this administration, to move in the direction of granting additional money. So how do you respond to these two different aspects?
And for us, for all the development banks, the United States has been part of our creation for most of us, and it has been a very important shareholder and remains so. We have been meeting with the U.S. Authorities as they're coming with the new administration. I, haven't heard from them saying, oh, we want to disengage. Actually, if you take the so-called skinny budget and you read the position that is taken on IDA and on the World Bank there, they basically say we value our place and role. In other words, we are not prepared to withdraw from the World Bank. So if we talk about shareholding, I think the United States is not going to say, oh, we ignore our place and role in the financial institutions, because it is not going to be aligned with their view that they need to have a strong role in the world. In other words, paradoxically, it's not so much aligned with America First for you to ignore your place in institutions where you are a very important, prominent voice. Of course, we all need to see how the administration would frame policies, and we would like to be engaged in that discussion as everybody else is looking at a new administration to make sure that they can see the world in its totality and its diversity. When it comes down to financial contributions, we are mindful that when a new administration comes, whether it is in this country or any other country, it would take some time to figure out what is their standing on all kinds of issues. And I don't believe that the financing of the World Bank is top of mind concern. There are many issues they need to go through. So the question is, what is our value proposition? What is it that we put forward? And what we put forward is very clear. One, we are a bank. You put money in, you get money out. We have, since we have been created, not very well known, but the total contribution of our shareholders as paid-in capital is, I'm looking at Axel there, $15 billion. Against this $15 billion, we have provided over $700 billion in loans that have been paid back. They have been paid back with interest that funds our costs and provides for reserves, increasing the capital of the bank, plus $20 billion that we have given IDA as our contribution, so it reduces the bill to you, the taxpayers. In other words, we are a very good value for money place. Two, where are we? We are in Iraq, we are in Afghanistan, hopefully we would be in Syria one day. Places that require investments and stabilization. I don't see how that would be bad for any of our shareholders to have a more stable world. Three, if we are successful to reduce barriers to investments for private capital to flow in emerging economies, that is, I think, good for any of our shareholders, and we certainly believe it is good for our largest shareholder. On that basis, I think my job is not to worry about this, but to worry about delivery, 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 getting the job done, serving the people that need our help, be there for them.
Well, thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions from the public. Can you identify yourself, please? Well, I know you, but
Good afternoon. My name is Frank Vogel. I'm with a group called Transparency International. I want to talk about the subject that you said breaks your heart, and I would add to your excellent diagnosis that corruption is a factor. 35 years ago, almost exactly 35 years ago, because of the massive problems of poverty and the attitude of the then US administration, a group of us met at Brookings and created the Bretton Woods Committee. And at that time, the suggestion was that members of the business community and American citizens should help the bank with Congress and the White House. Today, 20 million people are going to starve to death in the countries you mentioned. The United Nations is in trouble. What do you suggest members of the Bretton Woods Committee should do, rather than what the bank should do, to strengthen public support and the support of this administration and Congress for the actions necessary, and perhaps tell us what actions you think is necessary, in order to alleviate the massive problem of starvation, the worst that sub-Saharan Africa has seen in over 30 years. Thank you.
Should I? Thank you for serving on the Bretton Woods Committee. Let me start from what we do and what we will do more of. In the face of this catastrophe, we have already asked our board, I saw one of our board members in the audience, to give us the permission to come up with a very sizable support for the countries and actually the people that are at risk of starvation. $1.6 billion by restructuring existing projects to deal with this utmost priority, and by adding additional 770 million of new money from the crisis response window and other parts of IDA. So we can go to the international community, as we have already done. We called a meeting on March 27th on that, and on the 22nd this week there would be another one that Antonio Guterres and Jim Kim will co-chair, to raise the attention of the world, because there is so much happening that remarkably something that is so tragic and unacceptable is actually not getting the attention it deserves. And we hope that people in this audience, if you have access to any high corridor of power, use it, so we can act early and prevent a tragedy. But as much as we are focused on the money, there is an aspect of this famine that is not entirely in the hands of development in humanitarian community, and it is the wars, the conflicts. Bringing peace in South Sudan depends on the warring parties in South Sudan, and it depends on the rest of the world putting pressure through any possible channel. So this is what I would advocate, to put that pressure on those that can facilitate, support a direction towards peace, so help can get to the people who need it. You mentioned corruption, and I cannot agree with you more, that especially when resources are scarce, anytime, but especially when resources are scarce, to be siphoned for private use is immoral and catastrophic for the capacity of a country to go up in prosperity. And I'm very grateful to the other Jim Wolfenson. That was the president of the World Bank that said, unless we remove the cancer of corruption, development simply cannot succeed entirely. And it is with us today as it was then. And actually, what do you do about it? What I learned in my life, put the light on it for everybody to see. And what we do in the bank now, a lot of is just simply information and data. Yeah. Remove obstacles for everybody to see, so citizens can put pressure.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Before you formulate the question, I could not agree with you more on this corruption issue. You know, in the continent, in Latin America, there's always been a corruption problem, but never has it surfaced as it has surfaced recently. And I'm talking in many countries. But the good thing that's coming out of it is that it's in the top of the social agenda, that people are really demanding an end to this. Let me just finish here. And,
Yes, I'm Riaz Naqshbandi from Kogad School of Business at American University. The World Bank and the IMF are doing wonderful job in advancing the knowledge about Islamic finance. Do you see any additional activities that the World Bank might take in order to disseminate that it is a hidden information and it is very powerful in terms of advancing so many aspects of alleviating poverty to financing infrastructure projects? Thank you.
That is a wonderful question. Yes, we actually have been working with the Islamic Development Bank, and we have issued the first zakat. I think it was for immunization. I'm not sure. I don't take my word on that. But the World Bank has found that we can raise more financing by respecting what would be in the Muslim communities would be a good way to raise money. When I was co-chair of the panel on humanitarian finance, one of the big observations we made was that Islamic finance is the untapped resource to help the world's most disadvantaged people, and we recommended to look into all instruments, the charitable giving, the zakat, the raising finance, and we concluded that if that resource is tapped, it can be in the magnitude of $200 to $400 billion, which of course dwarfs what we do with the development banks. So thank you for the question, and yes, this is something that we take quite seriously and already have some practical experience with.
Well, we have several questions from the floor, but we have a time constraint. So let me thank Kristalina.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, let me, as people are shifting around a little bit, we hope you'll come back and join us for what I think is going to be a very interesting discussion. Let me thank Guillermo for moderating that discussion, and Kristalina, thank you very much for the wonderful insights that you gave us about how the World Bank is adapting to the changes and the opportunities and the risks that exist today. And I think you gave us a real challenge in terms of what we as private citizens and others from outside the World Bank can do to, and the World Bank Group can do to help create support for this organization. I'm Jim Kolbe. I'm co-chair of the Bretton Woods Committee. I guess I come to that position by virtue of the fact that I'm a recovering former member of Congress. I hope you won't hold that too much against me here this afternoon. But it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to welcome to the stage with me President Takehiko Nakao of the Asia Development Bank. And so I'm going to sit down, take a couple of words of introduction for him, and we'll get our conversation started here. Thank you again. Well, Mr. Nakao is, as you know, president of the Asia Development Bank. He's now celebrating, I believe this month, your 3rd anniversary as the president of the bank, but it comes from a long background in international finance and the world of finance itself. 3 decades of work mostly in the Japanese Ministry of Finance, including being vice minister for international finance, and served for a time here in Washington, D.C. with the Japanese embassy, and has been a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo, so is very qualified to talk about some of these issues that we have here today. Mr. Kao, again, thank you very much for joining us here. This is an important milestone, your 50th anniversary, the bank's 50th anniversary. And so it might be a good time perhaps for a little reflection on what the bank might be thinking about in terms of where it is going, how it needs to reinvent itself, what kind of changes need to be made, and what you see the future for the bank. So let me just give you that kind of broad question as an opening one. I will come to a couple more specific ones as we go forward.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to join this meeting today. And so 50 years anniversaries, and we was, is the mic working? Yeah, yes.
Let's see if we, this one is.
Okay, okay. So I'll use this
There
way.
you go, you got it, it's got it.
So 50 years ago, ADB was established. And at that moment, in the beginning, America was not very forthcoming because there was already World Bank. But because the Inter-American Development Bank was already established in 1960, and also African Development Bank was founded in 1964. There was a very strong wish among Asian countries to have our bank, Asian Bank. But there was the idea that we should have a bank without non-regional members like America, because African Development Bank didn't have non-regional members, including Europeans. So, but the Japanese planners and also other peoples in Asia wanted to have the bank, and the idea was it's better, we need to involve non-regional members, including America or Canada and also European countries, because Asia was in shortage of funding. Japan was continuing to have a current account deficit, and also Japan was the only developed countries among Asia. So the idea was to establish a bank to mobilize resources from America or European capital markets. And Eugene Black, who was president of the World Bank, advised ADB. So the first bond issue was in 1969 in Mark, in Frankfurt, and in 1970, the ADB issued first samurai bond, yen-denominated bond in Tokyo market, and in 1971 in American capital market. So the idea is not just the public finance, but it is how to mobilize resources from private sector. That's what I really want to mention. And in these 50 years, the membership was widened to include China in 1986. In the beginning, it was Taipei, China. And India was not the borrowing member, because if India starts borrowing, the resources evaporated. But in 1986, it started borrowing in addition to the World Bank. And Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, those are basically founding members, but they were detached because of conflict, but they became once again re-engaged in 1990s, started borrowing a lot. And also transition economies in Central Asia started become members in 1990s. So through financing, together with the knowledge, and through policy discussions about how to make system more open, open trade and investment regimes, prudent macroeconomic policies, deregulations, governance, inclusiveness, those policies were promoted by ADB with the very candid discussions, together with the discussion with the IMF and the World Bank. I don't think there is no other way than the kind of a Bretton Woods consensus or Washington consensus or whatever, prudent macroeconomic policies, investment in infrastructure, people, and so on. There is no other option. So Asia has grown based on these good policies, and I really believe ADB has been part of it, especially the joining of China in 1986 by keeping Taipei, China as a member in the separate ED's executive directors constituency out of 12 was very success. And Asia is now more integrated, but also very open economies as a whole, and that was a reason for success. We need to keep this momentum, and there are so many pessimistic ideas about the future of the world, including secular stagnation. But as far as Asia is concerned, even after the global financial crisis, Asia has been growing at the pace of 6% or so. China is moderating, but India is growing at the pace of more than 7%. Myanmar has started growth, and Vietnam's, Bangladesh, these countries are also growing very strong. So as far as Asia is concerned, it's too early to worry about the stagnations. People want to spend more for air conditions, fans, and bikes, and automobiles, and cosmetics, and sightseeing. There is a strong demand. Why do we need to worry about stagnation in Asia? As far as the policies are appropriate, I think Asia can continue to grow.
Well, you've articulated a fairly optimistic future. There we go, that's probably easier for you. You've articulated a fairly optimistic future for Asia and its development. Going forward, what kind of trends do you see are going to be? You've mentioned what's happened with China. You've mentioned what's happened with India, the fact that the Southeast Asia countries have joined or rejoined the bank. What do you see happening in the next, say, decade or so? What would you look for?
Yeah. It doesn't work. Is this working? Or?
Let's see. Let me see if that's on. Let me see if I can.
Okay. There is a switch. So I'm generally optimistic because there are so many pessimistic ideas in the world, including secular stagnation and so on. But at the same time, Asia cannot be complacent. We have so many challenges. One challenge, imminent challenge, is whether the slowdown of Chinese economy is going smoothly. And there is a lot of investment after the global financial crisis. There is some over-investment in some areas. So the Chinese authorities know it. And I visit China at least twice or 3 times a year. And I always have a very deep discussion with the Minister of Finance or other authorities. And China's transition to more consumption dependent, more service sector dependent instead of investment and manufacturing is one challenge. India, I met Prime Minister Modi twice, and he's so determined. And he has been successful in making tax system more integrated through goods and service tax and other reforms. But can they sustain it? And it's so, kind of states' powers are very strong. So how to integrate the economy within the countries and also integrate with the other part of Asia. Success of Asia, East Asia, was dependent on the supply network or production networks, supply chains. They were exporting, importing each other, and dependent on comparative advantage of countries. They trade a lot. India is more domestic oriented, but can it be totally open, integrated economy to other part of the economies? Indonesia also has many issues, including resource-dependent nature, but President Widodo is also so determined to deregulate the economies. There are so many good news, but whether we can keep momentum of the reforms, keep prudent economic policies, and whether we can manage the spirit of corporations and to manage the differences of opinions, ideas between countries. That is a very important point.
You mentioned that India has a very much a domestic orientation to its market. China, on the other hand, has always had a very export-oriented market. Do you see China rebalancing itself in some way and becoming much more domestic-oriented in its marketplace?
I would say that China is already becoming much more domestic demand-oriented. Current account surplus was more than 10% of GDP before the global financial crisis. But the current account surplus today is like 2% or 2.5%. So during this process, the growth has been more dependent on domestic demand, especially these days consumption. So I think it's a kind of illusion that as if we are talking about China as an export-oriented country forever. It is becoming more domestic-oriented. But the problem is maybe the combinations of the balance of consumption and investment. It is still so much dependent on investment, including real estate investment or public investment. They must promote more consumption. But I think Chinese consumers are so keen about consuming things. So I think, and over time, the service sector will be developed. Some of the service sector is still informal, but while economy continues to grow, people spend more for services. So I'm also a little bit optimistic about these transitions of Chinese economy.
Let me turn to a topic that has come up with both of the earlier speakers that we had here today, and that is the rising resentment or pushback against multilateralism that you see, not just in this country, but in Europe and other countries as well. Do you see this as having an impact on the work of the Asia Development Bank and the development that's taking place in Asia? How do you see the challenges of the pushback against multilateralism that you certainly see in this country and elsewhere?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to mention that the multilateral approach after the World War II, including Bretton's system, such system like ADB, has been very important factor of securing the stability and also the development of countries. So we need to continue to promote that idea. But at the same time, I think people are now starting looking at how about our life? And this is not really political kind of discussion. I would say multilateralism is important. But at the same time, it is also true that many factory workers, mine workers, those ordinary people on the ground, especially in advanced economies, because wages are converging during the process of globalization and technological advancement. Generally speaking, wages of developing countries are going up, while wages of workers who do the same textile factory works in advanced economies, those wages tend to go lower in real, real value. So it is true that some people are not gaining as much benefit as others. How should we address those peoples? And in the European system, I've been following, as you mentioned, kindly following these G7, G20 discussions, European crisis for years. And from my perspective, we need a very good balance of multilateral system, union, cooperation, or the kind of the community, but also we need a strong sovereign states, because sovereign states can collect tax, regulate people, sue people for crimes, and also it is providing more welfare. So we can go to the community, but at the same time, I think people are paying more attention to what are the sovereignties, what are the role of the governments, and we need a balance. I don't think necessarily this movement in Brexit or European continent or in the United States are the tipping time to go back to the bloc economies, total protectionism or total bilateralism. I don't want to see that, but we may face a certain time of reflecting what should be the objective goal of multilateralism. I think I speak more on my own instead of as a president of ADB. Again, about Asia, our role has been very important, and I still believe we can continue to support development, poverty reduction, genders, climate change, and also the friendship between countries. But at the same time, we cannot easily deny the ideas of ordinary people. That is my idea.
Before I turn to the audience for a couple of questions in our remaining time, your last comment raises one other point. As one of his very first acts as President Trump put the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement, let's say at least on the lower shelf, if not in the deep freeze. And I'm just wondering whether you think that has created some openings for China or other countries, or do you see the growth now or the resurgence of bilateral agreements? How do you think this may play out in the year ahead?
In a sense, it's very nice that China has now been promoting the idea of a free trade. But of course, China's domestic system is not totally open yet, and some people are worried about some stringent approach to some foreign companies. But it's very good that China is basically oriented toward the open system. But at the same time, America's policy, of course, it's not good for the most of our members of TPP that the United States wouldn't join it. But how to manage our open trade system as much as possible? It's one thing that we cannot have a new agreement, and it's better to have a new agreement. But at the same time, what is important is how we can keep open trade and investment regime that we have now. So I'm not overly pessimistic or totally kind of disappointed. We should make efforts, continued effort to keep the basically open trade and investment regime. I don't think America's role will be replaced by China so quickly, easily.
Thank you for those comments. Let me turn to the audience and see. We have a few moments for a couple of questions. If there's a question, do I see one back there? Yes, ma'am. Wait for the microphone and please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Tia. I'm with the New Rules in Global Finance CSO, and I have a question about if the Asian Development Bank has any specific programs in place to combat gender inequality in the workforce.
So we are paying great attention to gender issues because without empowerment of women, without the participation of women in many fronts, including works, but also the governance of government and the communities, we cannot sustain growth. And for ADB, gender issues are two fronts. One is about our operations. We started gender strategy in 1970s, and at that moment it was specifically women-oriented education program or health program and so on. But today, we have had many years of making our agenda the mainstream for any project, including infrastructure project. When we build highways, we have a capacity building so that women use this road, rural road and the highways to access better workplace and also to health and so on. So women's agenda issues in operation, but at the same time, in our workforce, among our international staff, which is a more, I would say, professional, although all people are professional, out of 1,100, about 1,000 are now women, but we are now targeting 40% at least, and also in the executives levels, higher than director levels, we are also targeting 40% at least. So those are sometimes not so easy because we are more focused on infrastructure, and graduates at this moment from civil engineering, for instance, is a smaller number compared to men, but we are making hard, difficult, very serious attention efforts to make a balance of agenda.
Thank you for that answer. Another question. Yes, sir, in the back there. There's two hands up. We'll take the one, yes, and then in front of you after that.
Thank you very much. Does this work?
Just press the bottom, I think.
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you very much. I'm Isaac Cohen. I am with CNN en Español. My question for you today is, are you having any kind of working relationship with China's Infrastructure Development Bank? Thank you.
Yeah, it's often asked questions, and we have been cooperating very closely with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and I had 9 times discussion bilaterally with President Jin of AIIB. He was vice president of ADB before, and he has had a very similar experience with me, like Minister of Finance of China in the international side, working for the World Bank and so on. So I have so many things in common with him, and we shared. I mean, ADB has shared a lot of experiences of safeguard policies for social and economic environmental impact of the projects. We also supported the development of policies for many issues, including legal issues, accounting issues, and how to avoid the integrity issues. So we have shared so many things together, and as I said, I had 9 meetings, and we already co-financed with the AIB for 3 projects. One highway project in Pakistan, one natural gas project in Bangladesh, and one new project in Georgia for, once again, road. So we have a huge infrastructure needs in Asia, and according to the recent estimate of us, every year we need $1.7 billion, $1.7 trillion of investment needs for infrastructure among Asian countries. Of course, much of them is taken care by the domestic resources, including taxpayers' money, government bond, and also private sector. But there are many things the banks like us, multilateral development, can do, and we do it, the World Bank do it. We are scaling up our operations. We are strengthening our sector and thematic ideas. We are streamlining procedures to shorten, speed up our procedures. But it's nice to have a new bank like AIB, and we are cooperating. We have so many things together.
Your mention of the dollar amount of needs in infrastructure certainly reminds us of how great the infrastructure needs are and the cost of that in a place like Asia. I think we'll have the final question right there.
Yes, hello. My name is Nathaniel Welch, and I'm also with the CSO New Rules for Global Finance. I was curious if the ADB has, if the ADB has had any internal issues regarding sort of modern geographical conflicts between member states, such as the South China Sea dispute or the Senkaku Islands issue, or other sort of historical concerns dating back to imperialism in World War II. I'm just curious if that plays any role or if it's much more driven and focused in its design. Thank you.
Basically, we are apolitical, or we are separate from political issues, and we don't go into the political discussion. But all I can say is ADB has been making a certain contribution to cementing the friendship between countries. So, for instance, India and Pakistan, there are some issues recently, but in many discussions at the ADB and also our meetings outside the ADB, they sit together and talk about how to enhance connectivity between these countries. So there are many issues in Asia remaining, but compared to 1960s when it was established, at that moment there was a Vietnam War and Cultural Revolution, and many countries are not integrated in the market system. Many countries pursued anti-colonialism or protectionistic import substitute policies. And there was a conflict in Cambodia in 1970s. There was a conflict in Sri Lanka. So there were so many conflicts. But today it's much more stable, although there are remaining issues. So I'm sorry to say this, but I think the reasons for the Asian success so far, at least to some extent, are based on 8 conditions. One is investment in the infrastructure, especially China was so keen about infrastructure investment. Investment in health and education. Many countries in Asia pay special attention to primary school education, higher education, and so on. Third is open trade and investment regime. Many countries didn't have it in 1970s or 80s because they were more taken by the ideas of the center, peripheral theories. It's better to avoid exploitation by developed countries by rushing into the industrialization, by protecting industry. It didn't work well. So open trade and investment regime was so important. Foreign direct investment is important. Governance is important, especially stronger kind of official sector to guide the economy well is important. And also, inclusiveness is important, how to redistribute income and asset and so on. And the vision is important. If we look at the policies of Korea and Singapore, it was because of the visions the leaders had it. And it's not the central control economy or not. We need a vision for any countries. And I think some countries, Asia, successfully did it. But one of the most important elements is stability in the region. As I said, there were so many conflicts. And now those countries outside the ADB in the beginning, China joined in ADB in 1986, and the regions, Greater Mekong sub-regions, countries became full members, re-engaged in 1990s. And overall, Asia has managed the stability. So although I cannot answer to your question directly, what I want to say is ADB has making contribution to cement friendship, cooperation. And I visit the countries every year for different countries, and I meet leaders, and I think that is one of the ways to support cooperation. And also, we'll have an annual meeting in Yokohama in May, the 50 years anniversary meeting. All countries, ministers will join us. That is another way to kind of enhance spirit of cooperation. I think that is one of the very important functions of us.
Thank you very much. That last answer to that question certainly gives us a great summary of both the opportunities and the challenges that face the Asia Development Bank. We thank you very much, and please join me in thanking President Nakao for
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce the next panel here. Thank you. We're all doing a little bit of double duty here this afternoon, so I'm going to introduce the next panel leader and bring him up on stage, and he'll introduce the other individuals that are going to be a part of this discussion. We're going to move the discussion into something I know will be very interesting to everybody, and that's the changing trends we're seeing in the political landscape. And we're delighted to welcome several experts who will be introduced by Dr. John Taylor, who will be moderating this discussion. I think many of you know that John Taylor is the Marion Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the George P. Schultz Senior Fellow of Economics at the Hoover Institution, also at Stanford University, which happens to be my business school alma mater as well. I've had the great privilege of knowing John during the time that he was in the administration, George Bush's administration, as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, and I served as the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee for International Organizations, and it was a great privilege to work with him very, very closely, and I have just nothing but the greatest respect and admiration for both his intellect and his integrity, and it's a pleasure to welcome him to the stage. John, thank you.
So my colleagues will join me. With Vanessa, there you are, Tharman, and where's Clare? Okay, great. So grab your seats. This is the purpose of this session is to examine where the different policy issues, trade policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, regulatory policy impact different parts of the world, different regions. And we're very pleased to have Deputy Prime Minister Tharman from Singapore, who's also been chairman of the IMFC, chairman of the Group of 30, and one of my favorite things, chairman of the Singapore Monetary Authority. How can you do all these things? And Vanessa Rubio, who's now Undersecretary of Finance in Mexico, previously Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs and for Development. So it's terrific to have you here with your experience from your part of the world. And Clare Woodman is the Global COO of Morgan Stanley International Securities, with global responsibilities, obviously, for coordinating various things about the firm and their investment strategies. So we're going to have a sense a little bit about what's going on around the world. So I've been asked to kind of start sort of describing a little bit about the impact of recent policies in the United States. So I'll take my 2 or 3 or 4 minutes to do that. I think the U.S. problem is pretty much what we've already talked about, is low growth. Maybe it's a little better than some places, but it's not good by our standards. 2.1% since the Great Recession was over, and of course, including that terrible situation even worse. So I think policy should be directed to raising economic growth above this 2% and get back to the kind of recoveries the United States has had in the past. I think in many respects, there's some changes that are either beginning or underway, or we could hope will happen, which will boost economic growth in the U.S. And they're the things I've been talking about for quite a while, actually. They're regulatory reform, tax reform, financial, monetary reform, even budget reform. And all of those, there's been much more talk about it recently. In fact, maybe the MD referred to the extent that maybe that's part of the reason for the more optimistic outlook that the IMF has put through, including for the United States. So as I see these policies, let's take regulatory reform, which is so much behind the scenes, and it's hard to follow, there's so many things, but the Congress has this Congressional Review Act, which has already rolled back 13 regulations that were passed recently. And then there's other things like that. Financial regulation issues, they're being reconsidered. The House Financial Services Committee has a whole set of reforms, actually passed the whole House of Representatives, and administration is looking at those. We don't know where they'll come out exactly. It's part of a review the Secretary of the Treasury is working on. But it's a different outlook in both of those items than before. Tax reform gets a huge amount of discussion, which it should because it's so important. And here there is disagreement. The border tax adjustment still being debated, but in the meantime, there's more agreement about what to do on tax reform than there has been for a long, long time. Trying to reduce rates, trying to broaden the base, and so that's a different kind of discussion that we've had. Even on the budget, the Secretary Mnuchin had an interview in the FT where he focuses on this infrastructure. Doesn't necessarily mean a big expansion of the budget. Depends on how it's financed. So the budget is something they're thinking about, and the budget director Mulvaney is certainly thinking about it, as you already have heard a little bit. So just on the monetary side, I think there's some move for the Fed to begin normalizing. I think that has international implications because other central banks are part of the international financial system and may begin to react to that. The dollar moved a lot after the first move, but basically it's kind of back to where it was before the Fed's first move. And I think that may be some reflection of the international reactions, at least possible reactions that are happening. So as I look at this changing situation, it drives me just to conclude with what about the international trade side of this, which is on everybody's mind. And I think it should be on our mind. And got to look carefully. We'll hear more about that from my colleagues on the stage, but what I'd like to think about the direction of trade discussions now is it's finding ways to further open markets. If you, again, maybe read Secretary Mnuchin's interview, there's focus on opening rather than closing. And that's what I think we in the international community should think about, whether it becomes more bilateral, the US and Singapore have a bilateral FTA, or different than the TPP would have been, whatever it is there a way that we can direct that dialogue, I say, in the direction of good economics? It requires work. It requires work from people like us to do it. So anyway, that's where I think of it, what's happening. It's a lot going on, and it's there's more agreement than there has in the past, not completely agreement. And the question is, can this actually be pulled off? Can we actually do it? And we'll hear more about that. Now, I think maybe, is it okay? We'll start with you, Tharman?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's always a pleasure to start without a question being asked. That's just right. But maybe to take off from what you were saying, John, I think the key issue when you talk about policy changes in the US or the Fed and what its implications are for the rest of the world is not so much about the short-term jiggles and the ups and downs in the markets, although that's something that has to be managed. The key issue is just uncertainty. It's an issue which pervades the markets. It's an issue which influences investment decisions or the lack of them. And it's an issue that's, I think, affecting the politics of the land everywhere. There's too much uncertainty and there's a lack of direction. And I think we have to think more about that as itself an objective of policy. How do you reduce uncertainty? How do you get on with it? Set the cause, progress in calibrated steps, but be clear about where we are going. So that's a broad point I'd make, whether it's on monetary policy or a range of other policies. You've got to reduce uncertainty because it's good for investment, good for productivity, and ultimately good for inclusive growth.
Anything you want to say in particular about Singapore, Asia in this dimension, or should we come back to that?
We can come back to that.
Vanessa, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, well, I totally agree with Mr. Tharman. I think that uncertainty has been the main characteristic of the recent episodes of change, of volatility, of external shocks that Mexico has been experiencing for the last 6 months in particular. So what I think we should be looking into is to the fact that how this uncertainty that has been created by a lot of expectations, some of them more correct than other ones, some of them more intense than other ones, have created this anxiety and this volatility in markets that in the short term, obviously they matter for the medium and long term, but in the short term have created a lot of disruption in markets. In the case of Mexico, a lot of disruption in terms of the effects, a lot of disruption in terms of decision making for investment in the short run. And no matter, it hasn't, I mean, we have been able to be resilient because we have strong fundamentals, because we are doing the reforms, the 11 reforms, specifically those in the case of the energy reform, the telecom reform, the financial sector reform, have been quite proactive in terms of our implementation recently, but still facing these shocks have been quite a challenge despite the fact that we have macro stability, macro fundamentals. We have been able to grow at a rate of 2.3% last year, despite the fact that the industrial sector in the US not grew and had a minus 1% growth last year. So we have managed to be resilient in a context in which we have been implementing the reforms, in a context in which we have been developing the domestic market to make it, to create more domestic demand, the highest creation of jobs, 2.7 million in the last 4.5 years. But still, these shocks that we have been facing have destroyed a lot of value and have created a framework of uncertainty that had to be dealt by through a series of policies. And obviously, in the recent months, I think there has been an anchoring of the dialogue between Mexico and the United States. There was a huge array of possible scenarios that were discussed, and now we have been able to narrow them down and be able to conduct a more day-to-day and formal conversations with the US authorities in terms of trade, in terms of migration, in terms of financial fiscal affairs. So, and that's what we aim to. But still, I think that, as Mr. Tharman said, I think uncertainty is something of a novelty in terms of how we deal with it, how we are able to set the proper elements in our national and international structures in order to be able to reduce it and to have more certainty for the future, for decision making and for development and for growth and for these kind of decisions.
Thank you, Clare. Do you also want to talk about uncertainty or certainty?
uncertainty, certainty. Well, I think it's interesting, John, the last time I was sat here in October, the eve of the discussions in our meetings, we saw sterling hit an air pocket in Asian markets and fall 6%. And suddenly the discussion that we had in the meeting in October was very different than we were anticipating. You know, yesterday we all got surprised by the UK government's announcement that there will be an election called, and I think the process will be approved through Parliament tomorrow, that will happen. I think Tharman's absolutely right that long-term investors really get quite cautious in the face of uncertainty, and we, you know, try and think through how do you, you know, identify and assess and, you know, manage against uncertainty. And investors like clear frameworks around legal tax regimes and tax frameworks in order to be able to make long-term sustainable investment. And it sort of made me laugh yesterday as I was thinking about what remarks to make on this, because I thought most investors have been spending the last few weeks really trying to understand the French election process. Suddenly yesterday, they were like, forget that. How is this going to work? I thought the UK had a very clear law about fixed term of elections, and suddenly there's going to be an election in a very short space of time. But ironically, and I joke about this, but ironically, I actually think the election in the UK will help reduce some of the uncertainty and the potential instability around Brexit, because I think the government that's elected on June the 8th will have a very clear mandate and be able to go into negotiations with a very clear endorsement from the UK population.
Good. One of the things that the MD talked about earlier was productivity. And the IMF has studies on it. We've all been worried about it. U.S. productivity, by the way, is really terrible over the last few years. But let's talk a little bit about productivity. I know, Tharman, you've written about the innovation gap, and this to do with new firms and existing firms and productivity. And the UK's productivity has not really been anything to write home about, unfortunately. And even Mexico could do a little bit better. But Tharman, would you start off a little bit about the productivity issue?
Sure. Well, I think the broad description of the problem is well known. There's been a slowdown in productivity growth almost everywhere, most visibly in the advanced economies, where it's fallen off by about 1 percentage point in the last 5-6 years. What's equally important, and in fact something we get lessons from, is what's happening at the microeconomic level. Why do some states within countries do much better than others? Why are some cities doing better than others? Why are some firms doing much better than others? And something's been happening in the last 10 or so years, in fact, more than 10 years, that wasn't part of economic nature before. If you look at divergences within countries, they've widened. For reasons that are not fully understood. If you take the United States, for instance, for about 100 years, states were converging in productivity and living standards. But something's happened in the last 20 years or so. They've started diverging. If you look at Germany, you see the same thing. There was initially a convergence after unification. But if you look today at Baden-Württemberg, you compare it with, say, Bremen, you get divergence. And I'm not talking here about levels of productivity or income, but growth rates. You would normally expect that a country or a region or a firm that starts from a lower level has a chance of catching up and therefore growing faster by copying, tweaking, and sort of taking best practice and putting it into place. But the opposite has been happening. Those that are at a lower level have also been growing more slowly in terms of productivity. And the best studies show that much of that difference is due to what the economists call total factor productivity or multi-factor productivity, which is the intangible side of productivity growth. It's not so much about the machinery, it's not so much about the amount of equipment you put together with workers. It's the intangible side. It's about knowledge, it's about management practice, it's about constant learning on the job, it's about a discipline of dynamism that happens in some firms and in some cities and not others. And there's a lot we can learn from that. Not just in the advanced economies, but the emerging world. If you look at India, for instance, the divergences in the last 10 or 20 years are remarkable. If you compare Tamil Nadu with Bihar, just a widening divergence. So we know some places are less developed, more backward than others, but what's important and what we have to correct is the growing divergence. And I think, if you don't mind me just speaking a little more about this,
please.
I think there are a few broad lessons coming out of the whole welter of experience, countries, cities, firms. First, it helps to be inserted in the new forms of globalization. There are too many countries stuck in the old forms where you export a commodity or you've got a few commodities that you export to the rest of the world, but there isn't much learning that comes from that. There isn't much of a supply-side dynamic that comes from that. That was the old globalization. And economists sometimes look too much at aggregate trade data, which is really quite misleading. The source of dynamism in the countries that have succeeded and the cities and firms that have succeeded is their insertion in global value chains, where you're integrated with cities and firms in the rest of the world as part of the same value chain. And the reason for that has to do with the supply side. It's not a demand side logic, it's a supply side logic. It's about the constant learning that takes place within the value chain and the discipline of having to just keep meeting higher standards, whatever you're talking about, whether it's pharmaceuticals or semiconductors or even processed commodities. That discipline of learning that comes from being part of global value chains. It explains what Nakao-san was talking about earlier on about East Asia. Basically, after Japan, it was the 4 newly industrializing economies, and then the coastal provinces of China. It was global value chains. So that's the first lesson. Too much of the developing world is not in the new globalization and is stuck in the old globalization. And there's a risk that parts of the advanced economies are also not embracing the new globalization. That's the first point. The second point that we're learning is that local strategies matter. Some cities do better than others, not because they are exposed differently to globalization or technology, but because they've got a different dynamic within the city. You've got learning communities comprising mayors and local authorities, universities and community colleges, leading firms, and parents and children taking their signals from what's going on. So getting a dynamic of learning within a city or a metropolitan area, anywhere in the world, does differentiate some from others. It differentiates success from stagnation. And I think the third lesson that's extremely important is regulation in some places is preventing people from moving from a declining place to a dynamic place. It's preventing dynamic places from expanding, either because of zonal restrictions on housing or expansion of the dynamic cities. And regulation is doing too much to preserve the status quo. And in the short term, there's always a tension. And frankly, there's a political tension between supporting disruption and changes that lead to improvements in productivity and preserving the jobs of today. And arithmetically, we know that there's a relationship between those two things. If productivity goes up, it usually means it's because you're displacing some workers, you're doing away with old jobs. But that's a short-term tension. The medium to long-term logic that has been seen everywhere is that if you don't lift productivity growth, you get income stagnation in the middle and at the lower end. And that's a much larger problem than the problem of short-term joblessness. So the better solution is do everything we can to allow for restructuring, to allow for the movement of people and firms from declining industries and regions to the more dynamic, do something to help them to adjust quickly, which the market doesn't do very well on its own. It requires state action. But at the same time, ensure that the jobs that are created are the jobs of tomorrow and not just the preservation of the jobs of today. That's how you reconcile this short-term tension between productivity and jobs. It is through supply-side action and coordinated action.
I think we can agree that the the growth problems are more on the supply side now globally. It's hard to point to demand side actions. It's really the supply side actions you're talking about. And I think this supply chains and the learning by that is so important. And I want to ask Vanessa here, a lot of trade agreements have emphasized the supply chain. And NAFTA, of course, is a big part of what people are learning about. Making parts in one part of the world and shipping it and the creation of different parts. But could you say something about how Mexico's benefited from that in the way that?
Definitely. I think productivity has been seen in this administration as a key and as a priority for national development. And it's the underlining effect that we expect, or one of the underlining effects that we expect as a result from the implementation of the structural reforms again. So, I mean, productivity has to do with education, has to do with better skills, has to do with lifelong learning for lifelong employability in order to be able to switch from these old areas of production to the new areas. But it also has to do with new technologies. It has to do with innovation. It has to do, for example, with the fintech sector. Financial technology is here to stay, is here to provide for financial inclusiveness, is here to provide for new businesses to arise, is here to provide for the faraway communities to be able to be part of globalization and to start a business and to be able to create a P4P or a crowdfunding activity within the financial technology sector. It is very important, another factor, which I think it's the youth, which I think it's the women participating more broadly in the formal economy. It's also a question of moving from informality towards formality. And I think it's a question, as I said, that it's underlying the whole of the reforms as a national priority to increase not only productivity for the export sector, but increase productivity in order, again, to enhance and to make a more robust domestic market. So I think, again, it's the reforms that specifically in the side of education in this aspect that will give us a leap forward in terms of being more productive. But it's all of these aspects that I have talked about that I think would create a conducive environment for a progress in productivity, no? And I would underline women's participation in the formal economy as being one of the key factors. In Mexico, 1 out of every 4 households is headed by a woman, and obviously women are paid 75% of what a man is paid in Mexico for the same job. There is a lot of informality. There is a lot of non-recognized job for women. So I think that is another pending issue that, in particular in developing economies, in particular in Latin America, we need to be looking into and to prioritize as well within this whole framework of having productivity as a priority for development and as a priority for competitiveness now.
So as I look at the data for the U.S., which I know best, I would have to add low capital investment to part of our problem. It's actually, capital per worker is actually declining in the last few years in the U.S. But UK's also had very low productivity. And I don't know which is it more capital, is it more the things that Tharman and Vanessa are referring to, or is it, what is it do you think is the issue there?
So I think it's a combination of all of the factors that have been highlighted, and I think the challenge for the UK is going to be that the next few years is going to be totally focused on the process around, Brexit and withdrawal from the EU and negotiating new access arrangements. And as you know better than anybody else, trade agreements take a long time to get negotiated. I think for Switzerland, it's been 8 years to negotiate trade arrangements with the EU. The UK is heavily dependent on service businesses and service industries, and there hasn't been a precedent of a trade agreement that I know of or arrangement that is defined for service industries. So I think that is going to be the challenge. The current UK government has a clear industrial strategy that they would like to implement that would, encourage and enhance much more capital investment in expenditure. But I fear and I worry that that may take a back seat whilst we have to work through the upcoming, trade discussions with Europe.
One thing is about the financial sector that many of us might be interested in is why has it moved so much? Why have stocks improved so much recently for some firms more than others, to be sure, but some think it's because of this better outlook on regulation. Some think it's monetary policy gives you more of a spread to work with the yield curve. Do you have, from your experience, Clare, do you have a sense of helping us through this one?
So I think, there was clearly a significant movement post the election results here in the US in the financial stocks, equity prices. And, most, I think, strategists and commentators attribute that to an expectation around relaxation on certain capital and liquidity requirements for US and foreign banks here, plus a combination of the impact of tax reform. You saw some of that, coming off some of those numbers in the first quarter of this year. But I still think that the market has an expectation that we'll see some, relaxation in reform. I'm not sure that there's going to be a complete rollback of regulatory reform, but we'll have to wait. I think the Treasury is due to report from the executive order early June, so we'll have to see what's there.
One thing that's also striking about the markets recently is exchange rates. The peso didn't do too well at the beginning, but it's recovered quite a bit. Do you think that's a change in sentiment, reflects perhaps a change in sentiment, a change of what's going to happen? And could you help us with that?
If you take a look the way the peso had evolved in the last 1.5 years at the point of November last year, it was basically an appreciation of the US, specifically vis-a-vis the emerging market currencies. But then after November started to be an idiosyncratic thing in regards to the peso. And obviously was a very correlated result of the electoral result in the US. And again, the volatility and the uncertainty that was created for the outcome, political outcomes in the US. No, so we come from different discussions with the US, more in terms of the secretaries gathering up with secretaries of Foreign Affairs, Treasury, Homeland Security, and the advisors in the White House, and anchoring the discussions specifically for trade. I think basically the two topics that have been placed on the table as part of the trade dialogue would be rules of origin in the one hand and the dispute settling mechanism in the other. That's something that Mexico is transiting with and that Canada is transiting with that we would be able to deal with. But again, there is uncertainty regarding the timing in which these discussions will take place formally, no? Because the announcement to Congress has to be made and then 90 days have to pass for the consultations with the constituency in the US, and then after that we can start with formal negotiations. So there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of times, in terms of expectations, but I think they have been anchored and narrowed down, and that has created more certainty. And obviously, I think a dialogue has been more structured, more permanent, more constant, more on a daily basis in many aspects of the agenda, and that has allowed for better performance of peso. We reached 22.09 at a moment last year. It was 18.5 yesterday. Still a lot of degree of volatility, but I think that markets are getting more used to this new anchoring of the bilateral discussions and the bilateral relationship with the US.
It's also, of course, not just the peso-dollar rate that's changed recently. We have euro and the yen
Emerging
have all
markets.
changed. The dollar is weaker than it was a couple months ago. One thing, all this discussion revolves around economic policy, and one of the measures of economic policy I like to look at are these indices of economic freedom, or the World Bank has the Doing Business indicator, and Fraser Institute has another. And Singapore is always number 1 or 2, maybe number 2 on these measures, which is always impressive. The U.S. has slipped significantly recently. Mexico did very well during most of NAFTA, but it's kind of leveled off. It seems like there's another burst because it's well below UK or Singapore or the United States. And the UK has also slipped a bit recently. So I guess maybe first, do you think these are helpful measures? Are these the kind of things that are going to help Mexico be more productive if they move higher on these indices? Or doing business, whatever happens? Are those goals that World Bank, the IMF can be pushing more to get better growth performance?
So I think the merit of these indices is that they are simple. Politicians all over the world can look at them and understand what it's about quite easily, and that it creates a mindset of benchmarking yourself against the rest of the field. And that's extremely useful for each city and country to know where they stand compared to the rest of the field. It's useful in education, where you got the PISA and other indices. It's useful in doing business, where the World Bank Index is extremely well used. But we've got to make sure we don't take the wrong lessons from it. If you take Singapore as an example, and it's not the only example I can talk about, it does very well as a place where it's easy to do business, which means that regulations try to enhance your ability to do business and to invest and to enhance productivity. But it's not a place, it's not a laissez-faire economy or society, because on the supply side, there's constant coordination between state, business federations, clusters of firms within industries, and unions. And it's just getting that speed of learning to be always faster than elsewhere. That's a very important source of competitiveness. So low regulations, where regulations will hamper investment and hamper the ability of firms to compete with others elsewhere, but an active coordinating role that's not about picking national champions, it's not about old-style industrial policy. It's about coordination, it's about plugging market failures, because the markets don't do this very well. You can get stuck in a bad place for a very long time if it's just market forces. But the role of the state to help players coordinate, not because the state has great wisdom or intelligence, but because there is a role for coordination in a market economy to help cities and countries learn faster, that cannot be understated. So the Doing Business Index, the various other indices are very useful because of their simplicity, and they create a mindset of comparing yourself with someone else. And that's extremely useful. But you don't get there just from market forces alone.
Vanessa?
I think I agree that they have this positive element of being simple, but sometimes also the challenge has been to be too simplistic sometimes in order, and not to have a thorough view of the different diversities within countries, among countries, certain characteristics that perhaps make one country more competitive against another in a specific aspect. So I think they are relevant. They are relevant as part of an array of products that you need to see when deciding on an investment. It's the macro fundamentals, it's the investment environment, the investment regime, it's the legal framework, it's the implementation of the legal framework, it's the evolution of the economy, it's the competitiveness of the economy, it's productivity. So I mean, they are a good indicator, but I think they're a good indicator among a broader series of information that needs to be used for a thorough decision for investment. So I think they're good. Sometimes there has been these issues about the methodology. For example, the Doing Business just changed methodology 1 year ago. So you're rated in a different way with the previous methodology than with the new one. So I think that we're working with the institutions, and every time we're improving and having standard setting bodies and having these indexes is a good thing. It makes things easy to compare, but at the same time, sometimes you have to go deeper to understand better and to make the right investment decision.
Clare, you want to?
No, I think the only thing I would add to that is you only need to run a few regression models to realise that some of those factors and indicators should be weighted more heavily and are more influential than others. And I think, in terms of, legal stability and rule of law, and I would say that being a former lawyer, and education, etc., and openness, and lack of tariffs and trade barriers are more influential in terms of driving competitiveness than some of the other factors. So I think you take those all into account, as you said, Vanessa, but you need to weight some of them more heavily than others.
I think it would be great if the distance between us and Singapore could be narrowed almost no matter what. But anyway, any questions that yeah, Guillermo. And then yeah.
Just picking up on your question around productivity and Tharman's reflection on differences within countries. I think NAFTA is a good example of a treaty that really had a very profound impact on the division of a northern part of Mexico, which is integrated into value chains and so on, much more productive, and a southern part of Mexico, which in relative terms is much poorer than before NAFTA. And this is, a worker in Nuevo León is 4 times as productive as a worker in Oaxaca. But even within neighboring states, and this is Tharman's point, there are very large differences. And those can be explained by a set of indicators like the rule of law, ease of doing business, good governance, and so on. I mean, there are very good indicators at the state level in terms of relative competitiveness. That was just an observation there.
Vanessa or Tharman, you want to comment on that? Value chains and no?
Well, definitely, I would say that Guillermo is completely right. I think sometimes the divisions and the variety between the north and the south in the case of Mexico existed before NAFTA, and sometimes in some cases have been exacerbated by NAFTA, no? Because obviously the north has become more competitiveness, whereas the south in general terms has had a more of a lag to leap towards the competition in global markets and in local and global chains, productive chains. But one of the things, for example, this administration is doing is the project of special economic zones that are going to be focused in the south and in southeast Mexico. That is one, it's a proposal in order to bridge the gap and to be able to make the South more productive, to give incentives for investment in the South, for investment in education, for investment in different infrastructure and development projects. And we're in the process of implementing them this year. Obviously, it's a medium run project, but still this year are going to be implemented formally. And with these, we are trying to bridge some of the gaps. It's not the only solution, but it's one that is already on the table and is already going to be passed as an executive directive in order to being able to implement. We have been working for the last year on their implementation, and we are going to be able to have a large part of it this year.
Good. Question right here first, and then Laura.
Hi, I'm Dalal World, past governor of the Central Bank of Barbados. My question is for Tharman, and It's related to the productivity point, because there were two things that you mentioned about what makes it happen that really resonated with me. One is that local strategies matter, and the second one, that the right kind of regulation also matters, that you want regulation that doesn't protect the past, but actually encourages, brings in the future. And the question is, because they resonate, because, you know, in our situation in the Caribbean, we are very much stuck with the kind of regulation that, defends the past. It doesn't work, but people are wedded to it, with their lives. And also strategies that really do not encourage the learning. So the question is, how do you change the mindset?
So just to respond briefly, because I think you put the question very well, we've got to find a way in which we can provide incentives for governments, federal and local, to do the right things and get a reward because voters vote them in again. Right now, those incentives are not widespread. Too much of politics is about an incentive to preserve the status quo. And ordinary people don't realize it, but they're getting, I'm trying to find a polite word, but they're not getting the right end of the deal. One of the benefits of transparency in today's age, where people have mobile phones, they're comparing themselves not just with, the Joneses are not just next door, the Joneses are the next city or a country far away. That transparency is now a much more powerful tool, particularly for a younger population in the emerging world. And I think transparency can be the new sunlight that rewards politicians who do things to create new jobs, to improve education, and to improve people's livelihoods, as opposed to preserving the old. Second point is that there's a role for federal policy that rewards the right local strategies. And there are lessons we can take all over the world. In fact, even in the United States. One of the most successful examples of industrial policy in the broad sense of the term in the United States was the, the land grant universities, where the federal government, a very long time ago, gave land to various states. These were not states that were particularly advanced or doing well, and the land could then be sold and the monies invested in universities. And these have turned out to be astoundingly successful universities. That is a form of industrial policy, and it created a whole dynamic around those universities. But it came about because of a federal policy. We have to think of many such creative solutions for how federal politics and federal decision-making can support the right behavior at a local level. And that plus transparency, which I think is far more potent today than it used to be, even in Bihar or many other places I could think of, far more potent than it used to be.
I think, just as an interjection, education support seems to me distant from industrial policy in the sense that such broad externalities for that, it's like basic research rather than specific. But anyway, you're very well pointed. Laura, over here.
So I thought the contrast between the concept of the government having a coordinating role and the government having a regulatory role is really an important one. And Tharman, I'd like to ask you to give us an example in the coordinating role. I think one thing that came to mind, and it really was touched on in a variety of ways, is all of the work that the government of Singapore is doing in the labor market right now to facilitate transitions, to facilitate training, to making sure that the development of the labor force is connected to where sectors are going. I thought maybe that might be, do you think that's coordination? Is that regulation? Is it a combination of a set of incentives? And I guess I would also think this is a question in general, because I think in Mexico you made the point about the importance of moving people from informality to formality. Some of that may be regulation, some of that may be coordination. It's actually linking them to supply chains in a coordinated way. So I'd like a little more on that distinction, coordination versus regulation.
So if I just give an example, I think in most of the fast-changing industries that you can think of, there's a phenomenon of a shortage of skills. We know very well the world of displacement of jobs and polarization of the job market. That part of the world is well known. But in the same countries, like the United States, like even Germany, like Singapore, there's also a shortage of skills for very good jobs. And for some reason or other, the market doesn't plug that gap very quickly or at all. Education systems all over the world don't take their signals very well from the job market. They should, but it just doesn't happen. And people can get the wrong signals. They can spend years studying the wrong things, and they come out and they're very frustrated. So just providing information alone is useful, but it's not good enough. You actually have to have a working coalition with employers, educational institutions, and with schools, which are the upstream side of universities and colleges, to actually sort of think through, look, how are we going to provide skills for the next 10 or 15 years? You can't predict the world, but you know that some things have changed compared to where you were before. And we've got to start changing curricula, we've got to start changing students' sort of impressions of what's likely to create success for themselves, and start changing the minds of the public at large. It requires not a paternalistic state, but it requires an activist state. And there is a big distinction between that. We sometimes scoff at these things too easily by talking about it as if it's a paternalistic state. It's actually about helping markets work better, because for some reason or another, some markets just don't work well. And there's a role for the state coordinating with other economic actors and non-economic actors to help markets work better.
Anybody else want to add on this? Or?
Just very briefly, I think in terms of the changing from informality to formality, I think it's a mix of both. No? For example, what we have done in terms of regulation has been to create incentives in order for people to have the right choice, no? and the right incentives to move towards formality, even to simplify the way an individual worker can start becoming formal and have a very easy way to do that in terms of doing it with the tax authority. But also it implies definitely a wide degree of coordination, not only of labor policies, but social policies, training policies, education policies that are also enablers of this transition. No? So I think it's both.
Questions? Okay, right here.
Yes.
Domingo.
Domingo Cavallo from Argentina. I heard worries in some emerging countries on the possible effect of the tax reform in the United States. Basically, that the lowering of the tax rate on corporate income plus the border tax adjustment could generate a strong appreciation of the dollar and force somehow a reduction in the prices of goods that enter into the foreign trade of the United States. Are these worries justified from your point of view, or probably it will be a sort of negligible effect?
So let me ask the people who would be affected for a minute. But first of all, there's different proposals. The border tax adjustment is one thing. The lower corporate tax is another. You could have a lower corporate tax and not have the border adjustment. So I just would want to separate those out. But anyway, what do you guys think? Yeah.
Well, I think, and forgive me for oversimplifying, but the nub of these proposals is that it's a value-added tax with a distortion. And the distortion is one of benefiting exports over imports. Now, if I can just make a broad point that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. For whatever the state of the world, whatever the state of demand, countries that have higher exports and higher imports do better than countries which have lower exports and lower imports. And there's a way in which importing is part of the dynamic of exporting and part of your participation in global value chains. And the supply side dynamic associated with high exports and high imports is quite different from the supply side dynamic of low exports and low imports. So as much as possible, taxes shouldn't discriminate between exports and imports. If you want to tax consumption, tax consumption. If you want to tax gasoline, tax gasoline. Keep it clean, keep it simple, and then help those who for reasons of income or opportunity need some additional help. So focused assistance for the poor so as to offset any regressivity that has to do with the flat consumption tax. I think that's far more efficient, and economists of both the left and right should agree on that. Economists of both the left and right should agree on that that's the fairest policy to help the poor, and it's also the most efficient policy to get growth going.
Vanessa?
I would only add that depends on which of the proposals implies a higher degree or a lesser degree of concern for a country like Mexico, and I guess for the rest of the world. But I think what we are looking into is, first of all, there's no proposal yet. There has been a lot of proposals. Secretary Mnuchin said yesterday in an interview that there's 100 people at the Treasury working on different proposals that might come in the coming months. So I think we still don't know what the outcome will be, but obviously the less disruptive for the world trade, for imports and exports, would be obviously a better outcome for us, and I think for the world in general. Some of the proposals that have been there in the noise and on and off the table, I think have a high degree of being disruptive for global trade and for the international tax regime and for local regimes everywhere. So I think we need to analyze once the proposals are set on the table, but definitely there's a huge difference between the degree of disruptiveness between ones and the others that have already been around the air. No?
Clare?
No, I mean, I absolutely agree, and I think sometimes it's lost that the UK's external investment is significant into the US, so obviously, you know, changing tax, etc., would be pretty meaningful. And that data point is often, you know, overlooked or missed.
So I think we have time. Is there a question here? Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Deirdre White with Pixera Global. Thank you so much for the comments on the role of state action and coordination. Really appreciate that. And I'm clear on what some of the actions and policies might be from that perspective. But while we wait for that to happen, do you have any advice for the private sector and large global corporations on actions they could take in terms of that new globalization and constant learning? What can we be doing while policies catch up to the current realities? Thank you.
Who wants to take that one on? You're not jumping.
Well, I think again at the local level, things are already moving and have been moving quite differently in some cities compared to other. Pittsburgh is different from Detroit. And it's not a matter of whether it's Democrat control or Republican control, because at a local level, businesses tend to want to do business with whoever's in government and whoever's running educational institutions. So there's a lot of that dynamic that can already take place, regardless of the broader sort of shifts in policy or you'll always get ideological shifts in one direction or another. But the fascinating thing that strikes you when you look at every large economy, you look at France, Germany, the UK, the difference between Leeds and Wolverhampton or Middlesbrough, is startling difference. Same country, same external forces, same regulatory apparatus, but different outcomes. There's something to be followed and copied from that cluster of learning that takes place in some cities so that we can adopt it in other cities.
So we'll have to leave it at that. The second hand just tells me to stop, and that's it. Thank you very much. Great.
It's a great honor and pleasure to introduce someone who's known to every one of you. It's Paul Volcker, former chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve System, a good friend, and I should say that these days Paul is dedicating much of his time to the Volcker Alliance, which he launched in 2013 to address the challenge of effective execution of public policies and to help rebuild public trust in government. This has always been near and dear to Paul's heart, as so many of you in the audience know are his friends, and certainly I've never come across, in all my travels around the world, a greater public servant than Paul Volcker. Paul, the audience is yours, and everyone's waiting to hear your thoughts on what's going on in regulation and elsewhere around the world.
Fulsome remarks, Bill. Friends of the Bretton Woods Committee, you know, I feel a certain affinity to this organization. I was there when it was born, and I am well aware that its origin in 1983 grew out of a deep-seated concern that the international financial system was under great strain. It's a common phenomenon these days. But that strain was considered to have potentially adverse consequences for international cooperation. The role of the International Monetary Fund, which of course had been established at Bretton Woods in 1944 as the guardian of a regime of fixed exchange rates, had come into question in a world of disorderly exchange rates. Meanwhile, its sister institution, the World Bank, found itself on the sidelines. Back in the early 1980s, there were massive flows of funds to the less developed world at their own volition, and it all suddenly came to an end, setting off the Latin American debt crisis of the early 1980s. Now, in the midst of those strains, the founders of the committee recognized that active American support of the Bretton Woods institutions and more broadly of international financial cooperation would be critical in maintaining a stable and open financial system in support of growth and prosperity. But here we are, more than a generation later. Major exchange rates are not fixed. Extreme fluctuations have at times continued to lead to distortions in trade and inflame political relationships. Recurrent efforts within and outside the fund to find greater stability have lacked support. And today, it's as much the United States that needs infrastructure investment as it is the old bank clients who are now fully emerged or emerging, and for the most part have their own recourse to market borrowing. Now, for all of that, what remains, of course, is the basic role of the Bretton Woods Committee, to force an understanding within the United States of the need for international cooperation, whether by means of the fund, or the bank, or other sister organizations. After all, Bretton Woods is not a particular institution. It is an ideal. It is a symbol of never-ending need for sovereign nations to work together to support open markets in goods and services, and these days in finance, all in the interest of stable, growing, and peaceful world economy. Now, in some ways, progress toward that end seemed easier, but I can tell you, of course, it was not really easy when the United States economy its dollar, its basic policy and political orientation were dominant. We can talk together about how the world has changed, the difficulty of reaching common approaches after I finish these remarks. But I do want to take a few minutes to speak about one area in which the need for big changes, national and international, was thrust upon us by the great financial crisis and its threat to the world economy. My obvious point is that the depth and breadth of the crisis demanded a coordinated response. And by and large, I think the international response, for all its fits and starts, has been reasonably successful. With the newly reformed and elevated G20 providing political impetus and cover, substantial progress has been made, particularly in the Basel environment, to strengthen bank capital and liquidity requirements. Common ground among nations hosting the main financial markets is being found in addressing the complicated challenge of orderly resolution of failing banks operating across national boundaries. Efforts to recognize and reduce the risks of derivatives are receiving some attention, as is the need to encourage coordinated oversight of the so-called shadow banking system. But for all of that discussion, all of that progress, I have a new concern. Perhaps it's inevitable that after a few years of recovery, rising profits, and the seeming restoration of financial stability, the presumed unshakable commitment to sustaining reform seems to be waning. That may be most evident in the United States, but it's true elsewhere as well. A few years of greater stability should not mislead us. Relaxation of key reforms and the temptation to retreat inward into idiosyncratic domestic approaches needs to be resisted. Fragmented approaches toward what are inherently international markets and inherently international financial institutions would have costs. Would have costs in terms of fair competition, global market efficiency, and the ability to reach a concerted approach in the event of the inevitable serious future crisis. For instance, diverging regulatory approaches might lead to ring-fencing banking operations within national borders. Coordination of emergency responses to orderly resolution of global firms would then be gravely impaired. Here in the United States, the Dodd-Frank legislation laid out at great length a basically constructive approach for financial reform, regulation, and supervision. Now, there's no doubt that the law and even more the subsequent regulations are highly detailed. After years of experience, a review of some of its provisions and practical effects is certainly appropriate. But let me say at the outset that claims that Dodd-Frank and other regulatory approaches have somehow gravely damaged the effective functioning of American financial markets, our commercial banking system, and prospects for economic growth simply do not comport with the mass of evidence before us. Here we are in 2017 with a nearly fully employed economy, close to stable prices. Bank profits reported in the press daily are at new records. The return on banking assets again includes the old benchmark of 1%. Loans at both large and small banks are at new highs, double the pre-crisis years. In fact, loan growth has been so rapid that it now exceeds growth in nominal GDP. Long continued growth, I would remind you, in debt faster than in GDP will inevitably spell trouble if long sustained. Today, non-performing loans are down close to the early 2000s, and prodded by the national and international regulators, capital ratios are higher than in many years. It's also true that the returns on bank capital have not reached their pre-crisis exuberance, but that's hardly surprising in an area of interest rates approaching zero. That relatively happy story doesn't negate the simple fact that review of some of the specifics of Dodd-Frank may be in order. For instance, reasonable questions have been pressed about the extent of the regulatory burden on community banks, institutions that play a critically important role in serving the needs of small businesses. It is also true that the basic role of community banks, channeling local core deposits into small business lending, is not systemically risky. And individually, true community banks are not likely to be too big to fail. So recognition of those facts suggests relief could well be appropriate from the burdens and complexity of international capital standards, from the full panoply of stress testing, and from the frequency of full-scale examinations and the complexity of call reports, all gauge necessary for more complicated, large and international institutions. Now that's easy to say, but the challenge, of course, is to define just what institutions are in fact truly community banks. It's not just a question of size. Trading activity and certainly speculative financial positions are not and should not, in my mind, be characteristic of a true community bank. Indeed, we should be aware of aggressive risk-taking in the form of community bank clothing. Recently, I noticed discussion has been renewed about the possibility of turning the regulatory approach back to prohibiting investment banking activity by all commercial banks. That is, to restore Glass-Steagall. That would raise much larger issues than a simple tweaking of Dodd-Frank or of the so-called Volcker Rule. The questions go beyond the reorganization of huge institutions at the heart of the modern financial system. I would point out that inconsistency with international practice would itself be a problem. Restoration of Glass-Steagall in any event must not enable large investment banks to free themselves from regulation and supervision appropriate for systemically important financial institutions. We must also be mindful that the combination of large banks and trading activities does give rise to chronic problems of conflicts of interest and the potential degradation of customer relationships. As you know, back in 2009, when Congress was debating the proper response to the financial crisis, I made a seemingly modest and sensible suggestion to help ameliorate that problem. Banking institutions protected by the federal safety net should be prohibited from taking proprietary positions, prohibited from speculation. Specifically, they could maintain trading operations responding to customer initiatives, but they should not deliberately speculate in markets for private securities or, within narrow limits, sponsor hedge or equity funds, the epitome of proprietary businesses. I was naive enough to believe the basic concept and intent could be readily set out in the reform legislation with appropriate supervisory oversight. And I have to tell you, after much debate, the prohibition took up less than 10 pages in Dodd-Frank. But of course, agency interpretation of those 10 pages became a grist for the lobbying mills that populate the Washington swamp. They pressure the regulators as well as congressional and administrative officials. Now, questions have been raised, some reasonable, some not, about clarifying the practical application of the concept. In the process, the regulators themselves, each with different priorities and financial industry relationships, haggled endlessly over the precise interpretation and enforcement of the legislative intent. They moved quickly. It only took 5 years. But helped by aggressive urging of the Secretary of the Treasury, the 5 directly affected regulatory agencies, the OCC, the SEC, the CFTC, the FDIC, and the Fed, finally came to common and certainly detailed language on a final rule. Meanwhile, my sense is that the large banks with sizable trading operations have been adjusting to the basic requirements. Proprietary trading units have been closed. Equity and hedge funds have been sold or spun out. Traders are subject to appropriate constraints, and there's also been a clear tendency for the most aggressive traders to leave the government-protected banking section for relatively unregulated hedge funds or other firms that are free to trade, to speculate to their heart's content, and to fail outside the official safety net. Importantly, statistical evidence strongly supports the view that the market functioning with respect to bid-ask pricing, market stability, and so-called liquidity has not been appreciably changed from pre-crisis performance. Data recently released by the Federal Reserve support those points directly. Put simply, customers can be and are today well served by today's trading markets. Two other issues, seemingly less pressing but of particular importance, definitely need attention. First, Dodd-Frank sets out a new approach for dealing with the imminent failure of a large, complex financial institution. The procedures are designed to deal with the awkward and politically sensitive dilemma between bailing out failing big banks with taxpayer money on the one hand and refusing such assistance on the other hand, with the clear prospect of precipitating contagious runs and huge damage to the economy. The point of the proposed Dodd-Frank reforms is to deal with that dilemma. It would provide an approach for dealing with an imminent failure of a systemically large bank by means of a new resolution framework and an orderly liquidation authority known as OLA. That framework explicitly sets out procedures by which the failing bank could in fact be reorganized and liquidated without precipitating infectious runs and a freezing of interrelated markets. Under the experienced auspices of the FDIC, managements would be removed. Viable operations could be sold. Stockholders and unsecured creditors would lose. In effect, there would be an orderly liquidation of the failed firm with breakup and sale of the viable operational assets. In the process, some temporary advance of public funds to maintain continuity of operations may indeed be required, but those funds would be secured by a prior claim on all the institutional assets and, if necessary, by fees imposed upon all systemic financial institutions. I submit to you that under the provisions of OLA, the failing institution will, by any reasonable definition of the word, will have in fact failed. There is no taxpayer bailout. Rather, it is the absence of a resolution framework that might inexorably lead to some future government to feel the need to rescue big failing financial institutions, just as happened in 2008 and 2009. Apparently, that is not fully recognized or felt to be credible by some in Congress. But what needs to be understood is that the existing approach has been developed in concert with other leading international regulatory authorities. This is an area where a common methodology is critically important. After all, the banking institutions potentially involved invariably are themselves international in scope. Now finally, Dodd-Frank and the whole reorganization effort has left largely untouched the regulatory and supervisory arrangements in the United States. The historically fractured regulatory framework is riddled with gaping holes and overlaps. The inconsistencies and approaches among the half dozen or more regulatory agencies stand as an enormous obstacle to achieving consistent, and effective oversight of the financial system. It was this disjointed regulatory structure, among other public and private sector failings, that lulled regulators into a false sense of security before the crisis, and it deprived them of the understanding and the tools necessary to address expeditiously threats to systemic stability. Now, a wholesale redesign of the regulatory framework was simply not possible in the aftermath of the crisis. There were simply too many other competing legislative priorities. Instead, to facilitate agency coordination and help close regulatory gaps, Congress established the Financial Stability Oversight Council, the famous or infamous FSOC, a super council of regulatory agencies that's chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury, with a specific mandate to identify and address the threats to financial stability. While aimed at dealing with a very real concern of agency coordination and cooperation, the FSOC has itself become a matter of some controversy. It's made real progress in data gathering and analysis in other respects, but we need to recognize the FSOC is insufficient as a vehicle to overcome the serious fundamental flaws in the regulatory architecture. It cannot force competing agencies to take coordinated action. It cannot itself be a focus for cooperation with our international counterparts on systemic issues. It's simply not adequately equipped for the challenge of fairly and effectively actually supervising financial markets with the complexity, sophistication, and size characteristic of the 21st century. I know of no matter of financial regulation in which there is so much common concern and common agreement among those regulated and those doing the regulation, and those who over the years have participated in reform efforts, of which there have been a number, concerned with the fragmented structure of regulatory agencies. Despite all that complaining and agreement upon the difficulties, there's enormous resistance to change. Turf is vigorously defended. Particular interests find advantages in institutional diversity. Now, I well understand that reform is a difficult political and administrative undertaking. There have been efforts, some 50 efforts we counted over the years since World War II to deal with this matter, all unsuccessful. My point here is to encourage the Congress and the new administration to launch together a serious study of how to deal with the shortcomings of a system which has simply outlived its rationale and its usefulness. That indeed is a project worthy of a new administration, interested not only in tweaking of oversight and regulatory procedures, but rather in simplifying an archaic, unduly complicated regulatory system, a structure that is itself acting as an impediment to efficient and stable markets. So given the nature of this occasion, Bretton Woods and all those two words evoke in terms of a grand vision of international cooperation and stable monetary systems, matters of financial regulation may seem prosaic. But I hope we've learned the lesson that financial distress can no longer be localized, that markets are inextricably interlinked. In the event of a future big crisis, there is no possibility of an international bailout of a failing American financial system. So we better work to keep it strong. Thank you very much.
So why don't you take a seat? Great job. Thank you, Paul. I think that you've given us a tour de force on the present status of the U.S. regulatory system and scene and its links internationally. I have a couple of questions for you before we open it up to the audience. One is, your mention of the need for regulators globally to stay committed to a shared reform program. Does the rhetoric coming from some in the U.S. administration, including the White House, concern you in terms of their willingness to continue working internationally as we've seen over the last few years?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure this new administration fully has a program and approach worked out, and they seem to be saying different things at different times, but I do think there is some danger of short-sightedness in thinking that we can credibly and durably develop a financial system and financial regulations that are insulated from what other countries are doing. Now, I could say the same thing about other countries. I hope they're not proceeding in a way that is incompatible with what's reasonable for us. But a lot of progress has been made in this area, most importantly, most obviously in the capital requirements area. But not only that, but we could never have gotten this agreement in capital requirements and gotten a substantial increase in capital requirements without bringing along the rest of the world in that direction, because there would just be too many competitive dislocations if you didn't have some consistency internationally. But it's true in many other areas, or in all other areas almost.
One of the other points I wanted to ask you to pick up on what you said is that one of the areas you've spoken about frequently, and you mentioned it in your speech, is a multi-agency regulatory structure here in the U.S. Do you believe that the Obama administration, where you played a role for a while, missed an opportunity to reform here and simplification? Not only reform, but end simplification in this area.
I think basically what happened was the administration and the Congress in particular were preoccupied with what was necessary to deal with the weaknesses in the system at the time, which capital was one, but many other questions arose. In both Mr. Frank's mind and more specifically in Senator Dodd's mind was the idea that they would do something about the number of institutions involved. But when they looked at making legislation, you know, was tough enough to get the regulation without burdening it with all the arguments about institutional change. But now, when the regulation and supervision and so forth are more or less settled, I hope, I think it'd be an appropriate time to come back, because the shortcomings of the present system are so evident. I shouldn't tell stories. I'll tell stories. It's not a story. If you read the official investigation of the financial crisis, they have a lovely interview with Janet Yellen. She was then president of the Federal Reserve Bank of California, where a lot of this excessive mortgage lending was taking place. And they said, we congratulate you, Mrs. Yellen. You called attention to the excesses of the mortgage market back in whatever it was, in 2004, 5, 6. She said, thank you very much. He said, Mrs. Yellen, why didn't you do something about it? And her response was a perfect reflection of the difficulties in the system. She said, well, I did take it up in Washington, but they didn't seem to be terribly interested. And it was not in my purview as the president of a Federal Reserve Bank. We don't have any regulatory authorities, so I had no direct responsibility for this. And, you know, when they passed Glass-Steagall, they left the broker-dealer under the control of the SEC, not the Federal Reserve. And the instruction was, Federal Reserve, you may have oversight over the whole holding company, but you better pay attention to what the other regulators think about specific parts, including what the other regulators thought about the broker-dealer, where all this is taking place. The regulator in charge of the broker-dealer had no interest in this subject, I'll tell you. And so what happened? A perfect example of a regulatory lapse.
Paul, you always get to the very heart of the matter. As so many of us in the room know, who observed that crisis and also dealt with you on so many issues when you were chairman of the Fed, particularly the Latin American debt crisis. One last question here, which is something you didn't cover before I open it to the floor. You did not mention in the speech consumer protection, which is a big area, in particular the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What are your views on this agency? As you know, it's highly controversial, and it should exist. And what do you think the future should be of this agency?
Well, actually, it's an interesting example because that is one place where they did make some structural changes in the law, and they brought Federal Reserve had some authority, SEC had some. They brought it all into this agency and gave it a pretty powerful mandate. And my impression is they've done geez, I thought the Federal Reserve did a good job on the little piece that we had when I was chairman. But it was a little piece of the whole. And my impression is they brought these regulatory and supervisory concerns together in a more comprehensive and fairly simplified way, partly because there was only one agency involved. Now the question that arises, is it really appropriate to have a one-man agency appointed that can't be dismissed by the president? Perfectly reasonable question too. Okay, if you want to change that, I'm all with you, but how are you going to change it? We said in my little Volcker Alliance, we had comments about this. The fashion is, and I don't know what else to do, you set up a multi-person board, and it's got to be bipartisan, and it's 3-2 or 2-1 or whatever it is. Unhappily, well, that system worked pretty well. It's in this polarized world in which we live now, it's become politicized. So maybe we ought to set up a board, but I guess our suggestion was make the terms long enough so that there's some continuity, and it should be multi-partisan for sure. But you make the terms long enough, not as long as the Federal Reserve, but more than 4 or 5 years, maybe you will take some of the sting out of the politicization. I do think it's important, which is done under the present law in an odd kind of way, that it has independence in financial support.
Well, I certainly hope the White House is listening to your views on this, and the Secretary of the Treasury and others who are going to be making policy in this new administration in this particular area. I want to open it for questions. I had one question was mentioned to me earlier, and so I'd like to, and we'd like to have hands up here, but I had one question beforehand, and I'm looking at this person to raise her hand. Yes, so.
I know her, she's illegal.
Yeah, that's right. Former Federal Reserve employee.
Right, that's right, he's used to be my boss one.
So why don't you get up and say who you are?
Well, you got to hold his things for me. Okay, Nancy Jacklin, used to work for Paul, used to also work for John Taylor, so I've got a lot of ex-bosses in here. You talked today about the importance of preserving a lot of the key elements of Dodd-Frank and not forgetting what took us to that point. The Volcker Alliance at the end of last year had issued a report about sort of the unfinished agenda in reforming the system, and you talked about the risks of short-term funding and runnable short-term funding and what that does to create financial crises. One thing that you hadn't mentioned in that report specifically is the contribution of our derivatives markets to systemic risk. And one particular aspect of them that seemed to me to fit into the Volcker rule type of issue is that the derivatives markets are now many times larger than the related cash markets and the reference assets, which suggests they're not being used for hedging. There's a lot of position taking in those markets. The question is whether that's a healthy and good and stable thing, or whether it is something that's contributing to the interconnections and the possible contagion in a way that may not be fully beneficial.
You've asked a question I'm sure I will not answer satisfactorily. Derivatives, at least the derivatives you're talking about, didn't exist for the first 70 years of my life. I've been able to fully accommodate myself to them. I think they are, when you see the volume of derivatives outstanding relative to the credits that they're supposed to be protecting against, there is clearly an imbalance. They act as an insurance policy, but you ordinarily don't have trading and insurance policies, and many insurance policies and the same risk. So I think there are some problems there, but progress has been made, and in the report you suggested, we did make some further suggestions, particularly in pushing as many of those derivatives as possible through an organized clearing house where you get much better protection, conceptually, if it's run right, against risk when the crisis comes, or the crisis won't come, because the obligations are better protected. That gives rise to the next question, which we did discuss in that report. What happens if something happens to the clearinghouse? And there does need to be some work in making sure that the clearinghouse themselves are protected by adequate capital and by support in other ways. It doesn't dismiss the possibility of maybe a lot of excessive trading in derivatives, but a lot more of it's been forced through the clearinghouses rather than so-called bespoke derivatives, which are probably more dangerous. So it's not an area where I claim any particular expertise, but I feel somewhat more comfortable than I did in 2008.
Work in progress, I guess, Paul. And Nancy. Yes. Please
Good
just
afternoon.
identify yourself, okay?
I'm Paul Applegarth. Two quick questions. One, what are your views on the fiduciary rule, the proposed fiduciary rule?
Yes.
And then secondly, regarding the future of the mortgage market, how do you see the future roles of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac?
On the fiduciary rule, I am sympathetic to it. I'm not a great expert, but it sounds right, and I think it is right. It's hard to object to it, frankly. Now, the argument is that some poor people can't afford to get good advice, but I'm sympathetic with it. The other part,
Mortgage.
Mortgage.
Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac.
That is clearly unfinished business. I mean, here we had the mortgage market was the heart of the crisis. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were, the word that comes to mind, bastard institutions, and I'm not sure that's a quite right word, but they were neither fish nor fowl, and the fishiness became apparent in the midst of the crisis. And one thing you could say after the crisis, let's not do that again. But we have not come to some consensus. We worried about this when I was back on this presidential advisory board. And point number one was don't repeat the mistake of Fannie and Freddie and hermaphrodite institutions. But it's very convenient to have it. And why is it as convenient as it is? The United States has a fixation on 30-year fixed-rate mortgages with no prepayment penalties, which are a lovely document for the borrower. But they're not such a lovely document for the lender, and particularly for institutional lenders like banks or in the old days savings and loans. So you wiped out a natural reserve of potential mortgage lending. And you'd like to see some movement toward more use of other than 30-year fixed-rate mortgages. As long as they exist, I think they're going to be securitized, at least in large part. And so we have to develop a system, which I think they're kind of doing by fits and starts, that will be safer than the old system, and you will have a lot of securitization. But securitization, I hope, protected by the private sector rather than the public sector.
Paul, do you think, just to follow up on that, do you think that this administration really should tackle what's going to happen with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? Because it's like kicking the can down the road.
There's been a lot of kicking down the road. Yes, they should. I mean, we ought to reform the mortgage market, but we're having difficulty doing it. And a major source of the difficulty is the inbred political convenience of these 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, which you need to develop a market structure in which they're viable and safe. And by fits and starts, I think we're doing that, but I would hope there could be more initiative in in what most other countries have. You have a maybe fixed for 5 years or something, and then there can be a refixing, and it's cost you a little bit if you have to get out beforehand. But you know, you're dealing with pretty deep-seated political questions when you begin fussing around with the accessibility of mortgages, particularly small mortgages.
Right.
So-
John, you had your hand up? John Taylor, over here, microphone.
There's a bill that's passed the House Judiciary Committee unanimously. It's passed the House by a voice vote, it's pretty nonpartisan, bipartisan, to reform the bankruptcy code for financial institutions. It's called the Financial Institution Bankruptcy Act. It would sit on top of Title II of Dodd-Frank. You have any thoughts about that?
Well, from what I may not understand it fully, but to the extent that that is an attack on the resolution authority, I think it's a big mistake. I don't think you can solve this through the ordinary bankruptcy. Some maybe there are a few that come along that you can. But I frankly don't understand what the complaint is. I think it's kind of, well, it's ideological or something. But there's a feeling that, I don't know, the FDIC can't handle this as well as a bankruptcy court. Bankruptcy court handling the failure of overnight, over a weekend, of Lehman or Citibank or anything, you know, it's just not with us. You've got to have some, it's got the peculiarity, you have to deal with these things in a hurry. You have to deal with them in a way that doesn't screw up the whole market. And the market, in those circumstances, is going to be very sensitive. And, you know, if the language can be tweaked to something, I don't know, but I certainly...
The microphone, because John, I can't hear you in the back.
It's not an alternative. It's on top. It's another approach. It doesn't repeal Dodd-Frank. It's Dodd-Frank stays.
Yeah, well, as I understand, it's an effort to put something in there before Dodd-Frank. And I don't know why. I mean, I do not understand why this approach is proposed. I don't understand it. Why? Is it because you don't trust the FDIC, or you don't, you're willing to take the risk? And I'm sure it's not because you want to take the risk and screwing up the market. I just plead ignorance. I do not understand why this is important. I mean, I know you can explain to me why you think it's important.
We're going to have you next year, John, talk about that. We haven't had any questions from over here. Yes, we have one right here.
Hi, Bill Salter from Citigroup. Recently, Neil Kashkari responded to Jamie Dimon's letter suggesting that too big to fail had not been solved and that higher capital levels might achieve it. Question one, do you think too big to fail, that we are in a reasonable position now, given the years that we've had to implement it? And two, do you think higher capital levels, or is there something we have to do about liquidity or some other solution?
Well, let me say, I think it's, the substance of my remarks may have suggested that we are in a much better position to fend off failing banks, which is the object. We don't have failing banks, we don't have to worry about too big to fail, because they're not going to fail. And that's what a lot of the controls and capital requirements are directed toward. The resolution process is just it's a safety valve that for all the increase in capital requirements or liquidity requirements or all the other supervision that's been introduced. If it fails, do you need this final backstop? I hope not in my lifetime. But I even hope not in your lifetime. In my lifetime isn't long enough to answer this problem. But this is just talking, it's a real, last resort, but I don't want to be without the last resort if you need it.
Okay, one more question. We could go on all night here, but we got to get Paul back on a train. He has television interviews, so please identify yourself.
My name is Nathaniel Welch. My question is, under the Trump presidency, I was curious what you think implications of a conservative majority board at the Fed might have on a short and long-term, national and international economics. Thanks.
It's always the last one that gets you, Paul.
The Fed, ever uber alles, the Federal Reserve shall triumph and continue and be strong. And I hope Mr. Trump and his associates realize the importance of first-class appointments to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, I must say, I made a comment about the politicization of a lot of these regulatory agencies. They weren't designed to be politicized, presumably, but it's in the air in Washington. I think the Federal Reserve has been exempt from that. I have had no sense in any serious way that people on the Federal Reserve Board take positions either on policy or in regulation that is kind of stimulated by political considerations.
Well, I think from Paul, I said it was a tour de force, and I think particularly with the new administration, with a lot of new ideas coming in, changes in the board of the Federal Reserve, what's going on in international regulation. I think Paul's speech was a speech for the moment and a guidance for the future and very meaningful. And Paul, thank you very much for that. But also, before we close the meeting, I have to say that this country owes so much to Paul Volcker, and so does the international system. And we're very lucky that
Bill Rhodes
he did what he
was
did.
there to save us.
So,
and the great thing about finishing with Paul Volcker is that when he wants to speak and share a story or perhaps a warning or two, we all stay and we all listen. So thank you very much, Paul.
there you go, Paul.
And as we close out today, I'd like to say again, thank you very much to the IMF for supporting us with a venue, to our sponsor, SICPA, to our staff, Bretton Woods committee team, to our audience for great questions, very thoughtful questions as usual, as expected. And most of all, to all of our speakers and moderators for today's event. Thank you very much. Reception outside, and this meeting is adjourned.